The Hidden Spark. Jacob Torres and the Shattered Veil. Chapter 1. In the shadow of the storm. Jacob woke to the sound of rushing wind and the distant crackle of thunder. His eyes flickered open, and for a moment, he didn't know where he was. The world around him was unfamiliar, a vast, barren expanse stretching endlessly in all directions. The ground beneath him was a jagged mixture of rock and glowing cracks of light, pulsating faintly like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Above, the sky was fractured, swirling with chaotic hues of purple, black, and gold. "What is this place?" Jacob whispered, his voice swallowed by the howling wind. "Glad to see you're awake." Jacob turned sharply to see Owen standing a few feet away, sword drawn, his face tense. Lyra was kneeling next to Ella, who was still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. "Where are we?" Jacob asked, pushing himself to his feet, though his body felt heavier than usual. Owen glanced around warily. "No idea. 1 second we were escaping that tower, and the next, this. Whatever this place is, it's not the city." Jacob's memories came rushing back. The tower collapsing, the void consuming everything, the catalyst's overwhelming power surging through him. He looked down at his hands, half expecting them to glow or spark, but they were still. The power was there, though, buried beneath the surface like a sleeping beast. Lyra stood, brushing dust off her hands. "Ella's stable, but we need to figure out where we are, and fast. This place doesn't feel safe." "Nothing has since the catalyst," Jacob muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. Lyra shot him a sharp look. "We're alive because of you, Jacob. Whatever this place is, we'll figure it out. Together." Jacob nodded, though the weight of his choices still hung heavy in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that this place, this strange, fractured landscape, was connected to the catalyst. As they started walking, the terrain grew stranger with every step. The ground shifted beneath their feet, the glowing cracks widening and narrowing unpredictably. Strange structures loomed in the distance, floating spires of stone and metal, twisting and defying the laws of physics. They reached a ridge and stopped, staring down at what lay below. A vast canyon stretched before them, filled with a swirling vortex of light and shadow. At its center, a massive structure floated, a fortress built from the same dark material as the void in the tower, its edges glowing faintly with the same eerie light as the catalyst. "I don't like this," Owen said, gripping his sword tighter. "That place looks like trouble." Lyra nodded. "But it's also the only thing here that looks like it might have answers. We have to go." Jacob stared at the fortress, his heart pounding. The pull of the catalyst was stronger now, guiding him toward the structure like an invisible tether. He knew, without fully understanding why, that the answers they sought were inside. "We go," Jacob said firmly. The descent into the canyon was treacherous, the glowing cracks widening into gaping chasms that forced them to take long, winding detours. The air grew colder as they approached the fortress, and the hum of energy grew louder, vibrating through Jacob's chest. As they reached the base of the fortress, a massive gate loomed before them, its surface covered in glowing runes. Jacob hesitated, feeling the catalyst stir within him. "This is it," Lyra said quietly. "Whatever's inside, it's waiting for us." Jacob took a deep breath, reaching out toward the gate. The moment his hand touched the surface, the runes flared to life, and the gate began to grind open. Beyond, a long corridor stretched into darkness, the walls lined with more runes that pulsed in time with the light of the cracks outside. Jacob led the way, the others close behind. As they ventured deeper into the fortress, a voice echoed through the halls, low and resonant. "You have come far, Catalyst Bearer." Jacob froze, his heart racing. The voice was familiar, the same one that had spoken to him in the tower, warning of the catalyst's price. "Who are you?" Jacob called out, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "I am the one who watches," the voice replied, growing louder. "The one who has waited for your arrival. The shattered veil has opened, and your choices will determine its fate." The corridor ended abruptly, opening into a massive chamber. At its center stood a figure cloaked in light and shadow, its form shifting constantly. Around it, fragments of the world seemed to hang in the air, floating shards of stone, fire, and water, spinning in a chaotic dance. "The veil is fragile," the figure said, its voice reverberating through the chamber. And so are you. But within you lies the power to shape what comes next. Will you embrace it, or will you fall? Jacob stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. I didn't ask for this power. I didn't ask for any of this. But if I can use it to protect my friends, to stop whatever this is, then I will. The figure tilted its head, as if considering his words. Bravery and recklessness are two sides of the same coin, Jacob Torres. Let us see which one you embody. Before Jacob could respond, the shards surrounding the figure surged toward him, each one glowing with elemental energy. Fire, ice, lightning, and stone, all aimed directly at him. Jacob raised his hands instinctively, and the catalyst's power erupted from within him, forming a shield of light that deflected the attack. The chamber shook, and the figure's voice echoed again, laughter mingled with challenge. Your journey has only just begun, Catalyst Bearer. Prove your worth, or be consumed by the veil. Chapter 2. Proving Ground. The shards ricocheted off Jacob's shield of light, scattering across the chamber and embedding themselves into the walls. The impact left him staggering, his breathing ragged, as the energy from the catalyst ebbed and flowed within him. Lyra, Owen, and Ella stood frozen, their faces pale as the figure loomed ahead, still cloaked in its swirling amalgamation of light and shadow. The chamber's walls pulsed with the same chaotic rhythm, as if the entire fortress were alive and reacting to Jacob's every move. Jacob, what do we do? Lyra's voice cracked as her gaze darted between him and the figure. Jacob straightened, forcing himself to focus. I don't think we have a choice. If we don't fight, it'll destroy us. Owen stepped forward, gripping his sword tightly. Then we fight together. The figure's laughter echoed through the chamber again, mocking and cold. Together, you say. Very well, let us test the strength of your bonds. With a wave of its hand, the shards embedded in the walls began to glow, tearing themselves free and floating into the air. They pulsed ominously before reshaping into spectral forms, beasts of fire, ice, and stone. Each creature burned with elemental fury, their eyes fixed on Jacob and his friends. Defeat them, the figure intoned, or fall as one. The beasts lunged. Jacob reacted instinctively, summoning the catalyst's energy to create a barrier that split the chamber in two. The fiery beast collided with the wall of light, sparks flying as it clawed at the barrier. Owen, Lyra, Ella, focus on the ice and stone ones, I'll handle the fire. Jacob shouted. Owen nodded and charged toward the stone beast, his sword slicing through the air. Lyra chanted an incantation, summoning glowing vines that wrapped around the legs of the ice beast to slow its advance. Ella, still pale but determined, drew her daggers and moved to flank the ice creature. Jacob faced the fire beast, the catalyst's power thrumming in his veins. The creature reared back, spewing a jet of flames toward him. He thrust his hands forward, creating a shimmering shield of light that absorbed the attack. The force pushed him back a few steps, but he held firm. The fire beast roared and leapt at him, claws swiping through the air. Jacob ducked and countered with a burst of energy that slammed into its side, sending it skidding across the chamber. The power felt more responsive than before, almost as if it was anticipating his movements. Come on, Jacob muttered, summoning another surge of light. Is that all you've got? The beast roared in reply, charging again. This time, Jacob sidestepped and fired a concentrated beam of energy at its core. The impact caused the creature to shatter into embers, which faded into the air. Across the chamber, Owen swung his sword in a wide arc, breaking through the stone beast's defenses and cleaving it in two. The creature crumbled into dust, leaving Owen panting but victorious. Meanwhile, Lyra and Ella worked in tandem to outmaneuver the ice beast. Lyra's vines restrained its movements, while Ella darted in and struck with precision. With a final, piercing scream, the ice beast dissolved into a mist of frost. The chamber fell silent, save for the echo of their heavy breathing. The spectral figure clapped slowly, its voice laced with amusement. Well done, it said. You've proven yourselves capable, but capability alone will not save you. Jacob stepped forward, his fists clenched. We're not here to entertain you. Tell us what this place is and why you're testing us. The figure's form shifted, growing larger and more imposing. You are within the shattered veil, the space between worlds where power and chaos intertwine. The catalyst has brought you here, as it does to all who awaken its potential. But power without control leads only to ruin. If you wish to survive, you must master it, and yourselves. Before Jacob could respond, the chamber began to quake. The walls rippled like water, and the ground beneath their feet cracked and shifted. "What's happening?" Ella shouted, her voice rising in panic. "The veil is unstable," the figure said. "It reacts to your presence, and your uncertainty. You must find balance, or this place will destroy you." The figure's form began to fade, its voice echoing one final warning: "Master the catalyst, Jacob Torres. Or the veil will claim you all." As the figure disappeared, the chamber's shaking intensified. Pieces of the ceiling began to fall, and the glowing cracks in the floor widened. "We need to move," Owen shouted. Jacob turned toward the corridor they had entered through, only to find it sealed off by a wall of light. Another path had opened on the far side of the chamber, leading into the unknown. "This way," Jacob called, leading the group toward the new exit. As they ran, the sound of the collapsing chamber roared behind them, pushing them forward into the next phase of their journey. Chapter 3: Path of Fractures. Jacob's lungs burned as he sprinted down the twisting corridor, the walls shimmering with the same eerie energy that had consumed the chamber. Behind him, the sound of crumbling rock and thunderous tremors grew louder, threatening to swallow them whole. "Keep moving," he shouted over the chaos, glancing back to make sure the others were close. Owen was right behind him, his sword still drawn, while Lyra and Ella trailed slightly behind, their faces tense with focus. The corridor twisted sharply, forcing Jacob to skid to a stop before continuing. The walls seemed to ripple and shift as they ran, their surroundings rearranging themselves in impossible ways. "What is this place doing?" Owen growled, his grip tightening on his weapon. "The whole thing feels alive." Lyra's voice came out in short bursts as she kept pace. "It's reacting to us. To the catalyst." The figure said. "This place is unstable, it's tied to Jacob's power somehow." "That's comforting," Ella muttered, her daggers glinting as she glanced nervously at the shifting walls. The corridor abruptly opened into another chamber, smaller but no less strange. Floating platforms hung in midair, each one glowing faintly. Between them, glowing streams of light flowed like rivers suspended in the air. "Another test," Jacob muttered under his breath. Owen scanned the room warily. "Looks like it. Let's just figure out how to get across before the whole place collapses." As if in response, the platforms began to shift, moving slowly but deliberately, forming an intricate pattern that would require careful timing to navigate. Jacob stepped forward, feeling the catalyst stir within him. The pull was stronger here, tugging him toward the center of the room. "I think I can guide us across," he said, though uncertainty laced his words. Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder. "We trust you. Lead the way." Jacob nodded, his confidence bolstered by her words. He stepped onto the first platform, which steadied under his weight. The glowing streams of light pulsed in response, as if acknowledging his presence. "Follow me," he called back, leaping to the next platform. The others followed, carefully timing their jumps to match the shifting movements of the platforms. The air buzzed with energy, and the glowing streams of light seemed to whisper faintly, their voices just beyond understanding. As they reached the midpoint of the room, the energy around them surged, and the whispers grew louder. The streams of light coalesced into humanoid shapes, their features indistinct but their intent clear. "They don't look friendly," Owen said, raising his sword. The light figures advanced, their movements fluid and synchronized. Jacob felt the catalyst flare within him, urging him to act. "Stay close," he shouted, raising his hands. A barrier of light formed around them, shielding them from the figure's initial assault. The creatures struck the barrier with bursts of energy, their attacks reverberating through Jacob's body. "They're not stopping," Ella said, her daggers ready. Jacob gritted his teeth, focusing the catalyst's power. The barrier shifted, forming spikes that thrust outward, forcing the figures to retreat. "We have to keep moving." They leapt from platform to platform, the figures in pursuit. Owen swung his sword to fend off one that got too close, the blade slicing through its glowing form. Lyra chanted another spell, sending a burst of vines toward another figure, tangling it long enough for them to escape. Jacob reached the final platform, landing hard and spinning around to help the others. Come on, he urged. Ella was next, her movements quick and agile. Lyra followed, though her face showed signs of strain from maintaining her spells. Owen was the last to jump, but as he leapt, one of the light figures lunged, catching his leg midair. He cried out, barely managing to grab the edge of the platform. Help, he shouted, struggling to pull himself up. Jacob didn't hesitate. He reached down, grabbing Owen's arm and pulling with all his strength. The catalyst surged again, giving him an extra burst of power. Together, they managed to get Owen onto the platform just as the light figures dissolved into the streams below. The room shifted once more, and a doorway appeared on the far side. Without a word, they rushed through, the walls behind them closing as if sealing off the danger. They found themselves in another corridor, this one eerily still. The walls were lined with strange symbols, and the air was heavy with the weight of expectation. Jacob leaned against the wall, catching his breath. That was intense. You're telling me, Owen said, wincing as he rubbed his leg. What were those things? Lyra studied the symbols on the walls, her brow furrowed. Manifestations of the Veil's energy, maybe. They're testing us, like everything else here. But I don't think they're mindless. They seemed purposeful. Ella looked at Jacob, her expression serious. And they were targeting you. This place, everything about it, is tied to you, Jacob. We're just along for the ride. Jacob looked down at his hands, the faint glow of the catalyst still lingering. I didn't ask for any of this. But if this power is what it takes to keep us alive, then I'll use it. Whatever it takes. The corridor stretched ahead, dark and foreboding. They exchanged a glance, their resolve hardening. Let's keep moving, Jacob said, stepping forward into the unknown. Chapter 4. The Echoing Maze. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, its walls shimmering with the same faint glow as the rest of the veil. The symbols etched into the walls pulsed softly, casting eerie shadows that flickered like ghosts. Each step Jacob and his friends took echoed loudly, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence that surrounded them. Lyra stopped suddenly, her hand brushing one of the symbols on the wall. It flared briefly under her touch before dimming again. These aren't just decorations, she said, her voice hushed. They're ancient runes, similar to the ones in my father's old texts. Can they help us? Jacob asked, glancing back at her. I'm not sure, but they seem to react to us, especially to you. She gestured toward Jacob's chest, where the faint glow of the catalyst pulsed in time with the runes. Fantastic, Owen muttered, his sword resting on his shoulder. More magical nonsense tied to Jacob. Why am I not surprised? Ella smirked despite the tension. You're just mad because the runes don't care about your sword. Before Owen could retort, the corridor split ahead, branching off into 3 identical paths. Jacob stopped, his eyes narrowing. Which way? Ella asked, scanning the 3 passages. Lyra frowned, running her fingers over the nearest wall. The runes might guide us if I can decipher them. Jacob, however, felt something else, a pull deep within him, like a compass tugging him toward one of the paths. He closed his eyes, letting the catalyst's energy guide him. This way, he said, pointing to the middle path. You sure? Owen asked skeptically. No, Jacob admitted, but it feels right. With no better options, they followed him. As they moved deeper into the passage, the air grew colder, and the walls seemed to press closer. The symbols on the walls changed, becoming sharper and more jagged. I don't like this, Ella muttered, her daggers in her hands. The corridor suddenly widened into a massive circular room, its floor covered in the same glowing runes. At the center of the room stood a towering monolith, its surface covered in cracks that leaked streams of light. What is that? Owen asked, his voice low. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes wide with awe. It's a focal point of the Veil's energy. A place where the boundaries between worlds are weakest. Before anyone could respond, the runes on the floor flared to life, and the room began to shift. The walls twisted and moved, creating new pathways that branched off in every direction. It's a maze, Ella said, spinning to look at the shifting passages. A maze that changes. A low hum filled the air, growing louder until it became a deep, resonant vibration. The monolith trembled, and streams of light burst from its cracks, forming into ghostly shapes similar to the ones they had fought before. Not again, Owen groaned, raising his sword. The shapes didn't attack immediately. Instead, they circled the group, their movements fluid and deliberate. Jacob felt the catalyst react, a surge of power coursing through him as if in response to the light figures. "They're waiting," Lyra said, her voice tense. "For us to make a move." Jacob stepped forward, his hands glowing with the catalyst's energy. "Then let's not keep them waiting." The light figures surged toward him, and Jacob met them head-on, releasing a burst of energy that sent the nearest one reeling. Owen and Ella moved in sync, attacking another figure from opposite sides. Lyra stayed back, chanting a spell that sent vines erupting from the ground, ensnaring one of the creatures. As they fought, the maze continued to shift, the pathways rearranging themselves. Jacob felt the catalyst pulling him toward one of the new passages. "We have to go that way," he shouted, pointing to an opening on the far side of the room. "We're a little busy here," Owen snapped, slashing at a light figure that dodged his attack with ease. Jacob gritted his teeth, focusing his energy. A wave of light exploded outward, momentarily stunning the creatures. "Go, now." They didn't hesitate. The group sprinted toward the opening, the light figures recovering quickly and giving chase. The walls of the maze shifted as they ran, closing off paths and opening new ones. "Keep moving," Jacob urged, following the catalyst's pull. They turned a corner and stumbled into another chamber, this one smaller and more stable. A large, ornate door stood at the far end, covered in the same glowing runes. "Close it, quickly," Lyra shouted as the light figures closed in. Jacob reached the door first, placing his hands on the runes. The catalyst surged within him, and the door responded, glowing brightly before swinging shut. The sound of the pursuing figures faded, leaving them in silence once more. The group collapsed against the walls, catching their breath. "That was way too close," Ella said, her voice shaky. Jacob looked at the door, his mind racing. The catalyst's energy was still pulsing, pulling him forward. Whatever lay beyond that door, it was clear their journey was far from over. Chapter 5. The Guardian's Warning. The ornate door groaned as it swung shut behind them, sealing the group in another vast chamber. Unlike the shifting chaos of the maze, this room was eerily still, its walls lined with intricate carvings depicting battles between beings of light and shadow. At the center of the room stood a massive statue, easily 20 feet tall, of a cloaked figure holding a staff. Jacob stepped forward cautiously, the catalyst thrumming faintly in his chest. "This doesn't feel like another test," he said, his voice echoing off the walls. Lyra studied the carvings, her fingers tracing the ancient symbols etched into the stone. "These depict the Vale's history," she murmured. "The constant struggle to maintain balance between light and darkness. This place is older than anything we've encountered before." Ella crossed her arms, her eyes on the towering statue. "So what's the deal with the giant statue? It looks like it's about to come to life and crush us." As if on cue, the statue's eyes lit up, glowing with a deep blue light. The room trembled as it shifted slightly, its head tilting down to look at them. "I hate being right," Ella muttered, drawing her daggers. A deep, resonant voice filled the chamber, reverberating through their bones. "Who dares disturb the sanctum of the Guardian?" Jacob stepped forward, swallowing his nerves. "We mean no harm. We're just trying to find our way through the Vale." The statue's glowing eyes narrowed. "The Vale is not a path to walk lightly. It is a place of power and peril, and those who traverse it must prove their worth. You wield the catalyst, boy. Do you even understand the burden you carry?" Jacob hesitated, the weight of the statue's words sinking in. "I don't understand everything, but I know it's the only thing keeping us alive right now. If I have to carry it to protect my friends, then I will." The Guardian was silent for a moment, as if considering his response. Then it raised its staff, and the carvings on the walls began to glow. The room filled with the sound of whispers, ancient and unintelligible. "The catalyst is both a gift and a curse," the Guardian said. "It binds you to the Vale, and through it, you are connected to the balance of all worlds. But the power you wield comes at a cost, and you are far from ready to face what lies ahead." "We don't have a choice," Lyra said, stepping up beside Jacob. "The Vale is collapsing, and if we don't act, It could tear our world apart. The Guardian's gaze shifted to her. You speak with conviction, but conviction alone will not save you. You seek answers, yet the answers you find may lead to more questions. Are you prepared for the consequences of your journey? We are, Jacob said firmly, his voice steady. The Guardian lowered its staff, and the glowing carvings dimmed. Very well. You have shown courage, but courage without wisdom is folly. If you wish to continue, you must prove your resolve. The floor beneath them rumbled, and 4 smaller statues rose from the ground, each holding a weapon, a sword, a bow, a staff, and a shield. Defeat my sentinels and claim the key, the Guardian declared. Only then will you earn the right to proceed. The sentinels came to life, stepping forward with mechanical precision. Great, Owen said, drawing his sword. More things to fight. They don't look like pushovers, Ella added, readying her daggers. Jacob felt the catalyst stir, its energy coursing through him. We've got this, he said, his confidence growing. The sentinel with the sword charged first, its movements swift and deliberate. Owen met its attack head-on, their blades clashing in a burst of sparks. Ella darted toward the sentinel with the bow, dodging its glowing arrows and closing the distance. She moved like a shadow, her daggers finding weak points in its armor. Lyra focused on the sentinel with the staff, chanting a spell that sent a wave of vines to entangle its legs. The sentinel fought back, firing bursts of energy that shattered the vines, but Lyra's magic kept it at bay. Jacob faced the sentinel with the shield, its defense impenetrable. He focused the catalyst's energy, sending a burst of light toward it, but the shield absorbed the attack effortlessly. It's too strong, he called out, dodging a powerful swing from the sentinel's shield. Then don't fight it head-on, Lyra shouted, dodging another blast from her opponent. Jacob took a deep breath, feeling the catalyst's energy shift within him. He concentrated, creating a glowing spear of light in his hand. With a shout, he hurled the spear at the sentinel's feet, causing the ground beneath it to crack and throw it off balance. Seizing the opportunity, Jacob charged, slamming his palm against the sentinel's shield. The catalyst's energy surged, shattering the shield and sending the sentinel crumbling to the ground. One by one, the group defeated the sentinels, their combined efforts overwhelming the constructs. As the final sentinel fell, the Guardian raised its staff, and the room grew still once more. You have proven your resolve, the Guardian said. Take the key and continue your journey. But beware, the trials ahead will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine. A glowing orb appeared in the center of the room, its light pulsing gently. Jacob stepped forward and reached out, the catalyst reacting as he touched the orb. A surge of energy filled him, and the orb vanished, leaving behind a faint mark on his hand. The Guardian's voice echoed one last time. The path forward is yours, but the burden you carry will only grow heavier. Tread carefully, catalyst bearer. The door on the far side of the room opened, revealing another corridor. Let's keep moving, Jacob said, his voice resolute. Together, they stepped into the unknown, the Guardian's warning heavy in their minds. Chapter 6. The Fractured Hall. The corridor beyond the Guardian's chamber was narrow and dimly lit, the walls lined with crystalline veins that pulsed faintly with energy. Each step Jacob and his friends took sent echoes down the passage, the sound amplified by the oppressive stillness. I don't like this, Ella whispered, her daggers in her hands. It's too quiet. I'd take quiet over more statues trying to kill us, Owen muttered, his sword resting on his shoulder. Lyra frowned, her fingers brushing the crystalline walls. These veins, they're not natural. They're conduits, channels for the Veil's energy. Which means we're getting closer to something important, Jacob said, the catalyst's warmth steady in his chest. The corridor opened into a vast hall, its ceiling towering high above them and its floor fractured into large, floating platforms. Between the platforms, streams of glowing energy flowed like rivers, their light casting dancing reflections on the walls. The air hummed with power, and the faint sound of whispers lingered at the edge of hearing. Well, that's not ominous at all, Owen said, eyeing the platforms warily. How are we supposed to get across? Ella asked, scanning the room. Jacob stepped to the edge of the nearest platform, feeling the catalyst respond. I think it wants me to lead, he said, the energy within him growing stronger. Of course it does, Owen grumbled. Jacob focused, extending his hand. The catalyst's energy surged, forming a glowing bridge between the first platform and the next. The bridge wavered slightly before solidifying, its surface shimmering like glass. "Guess that's our way across," Ella said, stepping onto the bridge cautiously. It held firm under her weight. "One at a time," Jacob instructed, motioning for Owen to follow. The group crossed the first bridge without incident, but as they reached the second platform, the air shifted. The streams of energy below them flickered, and the whispers grew louder, forming a faint, unintelligible chorus. "What's happening?" Lyra asked, her voice tense. Before anyone could answer, the energy beneath the platform surged upward, coalescing into swirling, humanoid forms made of light and shadow. Their features were indistinct, but their intent was clear: they weren't friendly. "I knew it was too quiet," Ella muttered, raising her daggers. The first figure lunged at Jacob, its movements unnaturally fast. He raised his hands instinctively, the catalyst forming a shield of light that absorbed the impact. "Keep them off the bridges," Owen shouted, slicing through another figure with his sword. The creature dissipated into a cloud of energy, but two more took its place. Lyra chanted a spell, sending arcs of lightning into the nearest group of figures. They recoiled, their forms flickering, but they didn't fall. "They're drawing power from the veil," she warned. Jacob felt the catalyst's energy pulsing in rhythm with the streams below. He realized the figures were tethered to the energy flows, regenerating each time they were struck down. "We need to disrupt their source," he called out, his mind racing. "How do we do that?" Ella asked, fending off two figures at once. Jacob looked at the crystalline veins along the walls. "The conduits. If we break them, it might sever their connection." "On it," Owen said, leaping toward the nearest vein. His sword struck the crystal with a resounding crack, sending shards flying. The energy within the vein flickered, and several of the figures faltered, their forms growing unstable. "It's working," Lyra said, casting another spell to hold back the advancing figures. Jacob focused, using the catalyst to amplify Owen's strikes. With each conduit shattered, the figures grew weaker, their numbers dwindling. As the last conduit broke, the remaining figures dissolved, their forms fading into the air. The streams of energy below the platforms calmed, their glow steady once more. Breathing heavily, the group regrouped on the largest platform. "Remind me never to trust a quiet hallway again," Ella said, wiping her daggers clean. Jacob looked ahead, where another door waited at the far end of the hall. The catalyst's pull was stronger now, urging him forward. "We're close," he said, determination in his voice. "Whatever's ahead, it's important." Lyra nodded, her expression serious. "The veil doesn't just test us for the sake of it. There's a reason it's guiding us here." Without another word, they crossed the final bridge and approached the door. As Jacob reached for the handle, the catalyst flared, its light casting their shadows against the walls. The door opened silently, revealing another corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly into the unknown. Jacob glanced back at his friends, their faces set with determination. "Let's keep going," he said, stepping through. The corridor swallowed them, its darkness giving way to faint glimmers of light as they pressed on, the trials of the fractured hall behind them and the mysteries of the veil ahead. Chapter 7. Echoes of the Past. The corridor stretched on for what felt like hours, the faint glimmers of light dancing along the crystalline walls. Each step brought a growing sense of anticipation, as if the veil itself was holding its breath. Jacob felt the catalyst pulsing rhythmically, its energy pulling him forward like a compass. "This place is endless," Owen muttered, breaking the silence. "It's like we're walking in circles." "It's not endless," Lyra said, studying the patterns on the walls. "The designs are changing. Look." She pointed to a series of intricate carvings that had grown more elaborate the further they walked. Ella squinted at the symbols. "That's great and all, but it doesn't help us figure out what's coming next." As they turned a corner, the corridor opened into a circular chamber filled with floating shards of crystal. Each shard hovered in the air, spinning slowly and emanating a faint hum. The air felt charged, and the walls were etched with even more carvings, depicting scenes of people wielding glowing artifacts. "What is this place?" Jacob asked, stepping cautiously into the chamber. "It's a memory well," Lyra said, her eyes wide. The veil uses these to store echoes of the past. These shards, they hold fragments of history. Why do I feel like touching one of these is a bad idea? Ella asked, eyeing the floating crystals warily. Before anyone could answer, the catalyst flared brightly, its energy resonating with the shards. One of the crystals floated closer to Jacob, its glow intensifying. I think it wants me to interact with it, Jacob said, reaching out. Be careful, Lyra warned. As Jacob's fingers brushed the shard, a blinding light engulfed the room. When the light faded, they were no longer in the chamber. Instead, they stood in a bustling village square filled with people. The sun shone brightly overhead, and laughter and chatter filled the air. Where are we? Owen asked, his hand instinctively going to his sword. This isn't real, Lyra said, looking around. It's a memory. Jacob noticed the villagers all seemed focused on a single figure standing in the square's center, a tall man with a staff that glowed faintly. He wore robes adorned with symbols similar to those on the walls of the Vale. That must be a catalyst bearer, Lyra whispered. The man raised his staff, and the crowd fell silent. The Vale is our guardian, he said, his voice carrying across the square. But it is also our responsibility. Its power is not a gift, it is a trust, one that must be upheld with care and wisdom. As the man spoke, the scene began to shift. The bright village square darkened, and the villagers' faces twisted into fear. A shadow loomed over the scene, massive and formless, its tendrils reaching out like claws. The man with the staff stood firm, raising his hand as the catalyst's light flared brilliantly. The shadow recoiled, but it didn't vanish. Instead, it retreated, lingering at the edges of the memory. Did he win? Owen asked, his voice hushed. No, Lyra said, her expression grim. He held it back, but it's still there. Whatever that shadow is, it's tied to the veil. The memory dissolved, and they were back in the chamber. The shard floated gently back to its original place, its light dimming. What was that thing? Jacob asked, his voice shaking. I don't know, Lyra admitted. But it's ancient, older than anything we've seen. And it's connected to the veil, and the catalyst. Jacob felt the catalyst pulse in agreement, as if urging him to move forward. There's more to this, he said. The veil isn't just testing us. It's trying to prepare us for something. Ella sighed. Well, that's comforting. I was just starting to think we'd had enough world-ending threats for one lifetime. Owen clapped Jacob on the shoulder. Whatever it is, we'll deal with it. We've come this far, haven't we? Jacob nodded, though the weight of what he'd seen lingered in his mind. He led the way out of the chamber, the memory wells warning fresh in his thoughts. As they stepped back into the corridor, the air seemed heavier, the whispers louder. The veil's secrets were slowly unraveling, and Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow they'd seen was waiting for them, lurking just ahead. Chapter 8. The Shadow's Whisper. The corridor twisted and turned, the crystalline veins in the walls glowing more intensely as Jacob and his friends pressed on. The air grew colder, and the faint whispers that had followed them earlier now became distinct, forming fragments of words and phrases. Do you hear that? Ella asked, her voice low. Yeah, Owen said, gripping his sword tightly. And I don't like it. It's the veil, Lyra said, her eyes scanning the carvings on the walls. It's trying to communicate, but I don't think we're going to like what it has to say. As they moved further, the whispers grew louder, until they seemed to come from everywhere at once. They reached another large chamber, this one darker than the last. The crystalline veins here were dull, their light fading as if drained of energy. In the center of the room stood a massive mirror, its surface black and reflective. The whispers emanated from the mirror, growing louder as the group approached. Something about this feels wrong, Owen said, holding his sword at the ready. Jacob stepped closer to the mirror, the catalyst pulsing wildly in his chest. The surface rippled like water, and a shadowy figure appeared within it. The figure had no distinct features, only glowing red eyes that stared directly at Jacob. Jacob Torres, the figure said, its voice a low growl that echoed through the chamber. Jacob froze. Who are you? I am the shadow you saw, it said. I am the one the veil fears, the one it cannot contain. The thing from the memory, Lyra whispered, stepping beside Jacob. What do you want? Jacob demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. The figure chuckled, the sound cold and hollow. You and I are bound, catalyst bearer. The power you wield comes from the veil, but the veil draws its strength from me. Without me, there would be no light, no balance. I am the darkness that gives meaning to the light. That's not true, Jacob said, his fists clenching. The veil protects the world from things like you. Does it? The figure asked, tilting its head. Or does it protect itself, hiding the truth from those who wield its power? You think you are a hero, Jacob, but you are just another pawn. The catalyst flared in Jacob's chest, and the figure recoiled slightly. You are strong, it said, its voice tinged with something almost like respect. Stronger than I expected, but strength alone will not be enough. The mirror rippled, and the figure began to fade. The veil's trials are nothing compared to what is coming. When the time comes, will you fight to protect the veil? Or will you see the truth and embrace the darkness? Before Jacob could respond, the figure vanished, and the room fell silent. What was that thing? Ella asked, her daggers drawn. I don't know, Jacob admitted, his voice trembling. But it knows me, and it's trying to mess with my head. Messing with your head is the least of our worries, Lyra said, her face pale. If what it said is true, the veil might not be as infallible as we thought. Owen looked at the now empty mirror, his grip on his sword tightening. Well, whatever it is, we'll take it down when we see it. No shadow is going to scare us off. Jacob nodded, though the weight of the figure's words lingered in his mind. The veil's secrets were deeper than he had imagined, and the shadow's presence was a reminder that the trials they faced were only the beginning. As the group moved toward the next passage, the catalyst pulsed again, its light steady and reassuring. But even its warmth couldn't completely dispel the chill that the shadow's words had left in Jacob's heart. Chapter 9. The Splintered Path. The corridor ahead was fractured, much like the veil itself seemed to be. The once smooth floor was broken into uneven segments, forcing the group to navigate carefully. Shadows danced across the crystalline walls, their movements erratic, as if mocking the faint light from the veins. This is new, Owen said, stepping over a jagged crack in the floor. Almost feels like the veil's falling apart. Lyra shook her head. Not falling apart, changing. The veil is responding to the shadow we encountered. It's unsettled. That doesn't make me feel better, Ella muttered, scanning the area with her daggers drawn. Jacob felt the catalyst's pull growing stronger, but it wasn't a steady guide anymore. It flickered like a hesitant heartbeat, as if it too was uncertain of what lay ahead. We have to keep moving, Jacob said. The veil's not going to let us stop now. The group pressed on, but the corridor began to split into multiple paths, each one veering off in a different direction. The glowing veins extended into each path, but their intensity varied, some bright and steady, others dim and flickering. Great, Owen said, staring at the branching paths. Which way do we go? Jacob closed his eyes, trying to focus on the catalyst's energy. It pulsed faintly toward the central path, but the pull was weaker than before. I think it's this way, he said, pointing to the middle passage. You think? Ella said, raising an eyebrow. Lyra stepped forward, studying the faint energy trails left by the veil's veins. He's right. The central path is the most stable. The others, they're traps. Traps? Owen asked. Lyra nodded. The veil's trying to test us again. It's not just about choosing the right path, it's about understanding the consequences of the wrong ones. As they began down the central path, the air grew heavier, pressing against them like an invisible weight. The faint whispers returned, but now they were fragmented, words and phrases echoing in a jumbled cacophony. Trust, betrayal, strength, fear. Jacob gritted his teeth, trying to focus on the catalyst's energy. But the voices grew louder, drowning out everything else. Make it stop, Ella shouted, covering her ears. Focus, Lyra called out, her voice straining against the noise. The veil's testing our resolve. Don't let it get into your head. Jacob forced himself to breathe deeply, the catalyst's warmth steadying him. Slowly, the voices began to fade, replaced by a rhythmic hum that seemed to guide their steps. The corridor opened into another chamber, this one bathed in an eerie blue light. In the center of the room stood a massive, crystalline obelisk, its surface covered in intricate runes. The energy from the veins converged at the obelisk, pulsing in time with the catalyst. What is that? Owen asked, his voice low. A key, Lyra said, stepping closer to the obelisk. Or maybe a lock. Either way, it's connected to the Veil's core. Jacob approached the obelisk, feeling the catalyst's energy surge. As he placed his hand on its surface, the runes began to glow, and a low rumble echoed through the chamber. The obelisk's light flared, and an image appeared above it, a map of the Veil, its intricate pathways and chambers laid out in glowing lines. At the center of the map was a swirling vortex, its energy dark and chaotic. That must be the Veil's heart, Lyra said, staring at the map. And I'm guessing that's where we're headed, Owen added, pointing to the vortex. The map faded, and the obelisk's light dimmed. The catalyst pulsed again, its energy steady and insistent. Looks like the Veil's giving us directions, Jacob said, stepping back. Directions to what? Ella asked. Another test. Another shadow. Maybe both, Lyra said. But whatever it is, it's crucial. The Veil's guiding us for a reason. Jacob nodded, determination hardening his expression. Then we follow the path. No matter what's waiting for us at the end. The group moved toward the next corridor, the faint hum of the obelisk fading behind them. The splintered path had led them here, but the challenges ahead promised to be even greater. And somewhere deep within the Veil, the shadow was waiting. Chapter 10. Whispers in the Dark. The next corridor stretched on endlessly, its walls narrowing and the glow from the crystalline veins fading into near darkness. The air was cold, each breath forming faint clouds as Jacob and his friends moved cautiously forward. This feels wrong, Owen muttered, his sword drawn and ready. You don't say, Ella quipped, her voice tight. She held her daggers in a white-knuckled grip, eyes darting to every shadow. Lyra walked beside Jacob, her staff glowing faintly. The Veil's energy is thinner here. We're nearing the edge of its stability. You mean it's weaker? Jacob asked, his voice hushed. Lyra nodded. And that means whatever's on the other side is stronger. The catalyst pulsed in Jacob's chest, its energy faint but determined. It was guiding him forward, but its rhythm felt off, like a warning instead of an invitation. As they continued, the whispers returned, louder and more distinct than before. This time, they carried fragments of familiar voices. Jacob. A voice called softly. He stopped, his heart skipping a beat. Mom. What? Ella asked, turning to look at him. I heard her, Jacob said, his voice trembling. My mom's voice. It's not real, Lyra said firmly. The Veil is trying to break you. Don't listen to it. The voice called again, more insistent. Jacob, come back, please. Jacob felt his chest tighten. The sound of his mother's voice brought back memories he hadn't allowed himself to revisit in years. Her laughter, her warmth, the way she always seemed to know how to make him feel safe. Jacob, focus, Lyra snapped, grabbing his arm. He shook his head, pulling himself back to the present. I'm fine. Let's keep moving. But the whispers didn't stop. They shifted, changing to voices Jacob recognized from his recent adventures, his father, his friends, even Owen and Ella. Each one seemed to be speaking directly to him, their tones filled with desperation and sorrow. Why did you leave us? You're not strong enough to protect us. You'll fail, Jacob. He clenched his fists, his steps faltering. The weight of the voices was unbearable, each one hitting a nerve he didn't know was exposed. Enough, he shouted, his voice echoing down the corridor. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Are you okay? Owen asked, stepping closer. Yeah, Jacob said, though his voice was unsteady. Let's just keep going. As they moved deeper into the corridor, the air grew heavier, pressing down on them like an invisible force. The walls seemed to close in, and the faint light from Lyra's staff flickered. Suddenly, the group emerged into another chamber, this one vast and cavernous. The floor was smooth obsidian, and the walls were lined with jagged crystals that glowed faintly. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, upon which rested a dark, swirling orb. That doesn't look good, Ella said, eyeing the orb. Lyra stepped forward cautiously. It's a shadow core. The Veil uses these to contain fragments of the darkness, but this one. She hesitated. It's unstable. The catalyst pulsed violently, its energy pulling Jacob toward the orb. He could feel the shadow's presence within it, a malevolent force waiting to be unleashed. We need to destroy it, Jacob said, stepping toward the pedestal. Destroying it could destabilize the entire area, Lyra warned. But leaving it intact is just as dangerous. Jacob nodded. Then we don't have a choice. He placed his hand on the orb, and the room erupted in light and sound. The shadow within the orb lashed out, its tendrils of darkness striking at Jacob and his friends. Owen leapt forward, slashing at the tendrils with his sword. Ella darted around the room, her daggers flashing as she cut through the shadows. Lyra chanted, her staff glowing brightly as she unleashed waves of light. Jacob focused on the catalyst, channeling its energy into the orb. The shadow fought back, its voice echoing in his mind. You cannot contain me, catalyst bearer. You will fall, as all the others have before you. I won't, Jacob growled, his determination hardening. With one final surge of energy, the catalyst flared brilliantly, and the orb shattered. The shadow let out a deafening scream as it dissolved into nothingness, and the room fell silent once more. Jacob stumbled back, breathing heavily. The catalyst's energy was faint now, its light dimmed by the effort. We did it, Owen said, lowering his sword. For now, Lyra said, her face pale. But that was just a fragment. The true shadow is still out there. Jacob nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. The Veil's challenges were growing more dangerous, but he wasn't going to back down. Not when so much was at stake. We keep going, he said, leading the way to the next corridor. The Veil's secrets weren't finished with them yet, and neither was the shadow. Chapter 11. Echoes of the Catalyst. The corridor beyond the shattered orb's chamber was eerily quiet, as if the Veil itself was recovering from the battle. The crystalline veins pulsed faintly, their glow weaker but steady. Jacob's heart still raced, the catalyst's energy drained but flickering faintly in his chest. Jacob, you okay? Ella asked, keeping a close eye on him. Yeah, he said, though his voice carried a hint of exhaustion. That thing was stronger than anything we've faced so far. Lyra adjusted her grip on her staff, her expression grim. It was only a piece of the shadow's power. If this is what a fragment can do, we're not ready for the whole thing. Well, we'll just have to get ready, Owen said, his tone resolute. Because running isn't an option. As the group continued forward, the catalyst's energy pulsed again, pulling Jacob toward another branching path. This time, the corridor opened into a small alcove lined with crystalline pedestals. Each pedestal held an object, glowing faintly with energy. What is this place? Owen asked, stepping cautiously into the room. It looks like a cache, Lyra said, her eyes scanning the objects. The Veil must have created this to aid travelers who've made it this far. Jacob felt the catalyst resonate with one of the pedestals. He approached it, finding a small, intricate pendant glowing with a soft blue light. As he reached out, the light flared briefly before dimming, as though acknowledging his presence. What is it? Ella asked, stepping beside him. Lyra studied the pendant, her brow furrowed. It's a focusing charm. It can amplify your connection to the catalyst, but it'll also make you more sensitive to the Veil's energy. Both the light and the dark. Jacob hesitated, then picked up the pendant. The moment it touched his skin, the catalyst flared brightly, sending a rush of energy through him. For a brief moment, he felt like he could see beyond the walls of the Veil, glimpses of the shadow, the vortex at the Veil's heart, and the endless expanse of energy surrounding them. Then it was gone, leaving him breathless. You okay? Owen asked, concern evident in his voice. Jacob nodded, slipping the pendant around his neck. I'm fine. It's powerful. Ella turned her attention to another pedestal, finding a set of throwing knives that shimmered faintly. She picked them up, testing their weight. These are incredible, she said, a rare smile crossing her face. Owen found a shield on another pedestal, its surface engraved with intricate runes. As he lifted it, the runes glowed faintly, and he felt a surge of strength. This'll come in handy, he said, strapping it to his arm. Lyra chose a small crystal orb, its surface swirling with light. This is a spell reservoir, she said. It can store energy for when I need it most. As the group equipped their newfound tools, the room's glow began to fade, and the air grew heavier. Looks like the Veil's telling us to move on, Ella said, sliding her new knives into her belt. Jacob nodded, leading the way back into the corridor. The pendant around his neck pulsed faintly, resonating with the catalyst and guiding him forward. The path ahead was darker, the crystalline veins dim and sparse. The air felt thick, each step heavier than the last. Suddenly, the corridor widened into a vast, open space filled with swirling energy. In the center of the chamber stood a towering figure cloaked in shadows, its form shifting and twisting. "You have come far, Catalyst Bearer," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant. "But you are still unworthy of the power you wield." Jacob stepped forward, the catalyst flaring in response. "Who are you?" "I am the Warden," the figure said. "A sentinel of the veil, created to test those who seek its core. You are not the first to attempt this journey, but you may be the last." The Warden raised a hand, and the swirling energy around it coalesced into a massive blade of pure light. "Prove your worth, or be consumed by the veil," it said, stepping toward them. "Looks like we don't have a choice," Owen said, raising his shield. Jacob gripped the pendant tightly, the catalyst's energy surging within him. "Then let's prove it," the Warden charged, its blade slicing through the air with a blinding glow. Jacob and his friends braced themselves, ready to face the veil's next challenge. Chapter 12. Trial of the Warden. The Warden's blade cleaved through the air with incredible speed, forcing Owen to leap to the side as it crashed into the ground, sending a shockwave rippling through the chamber. Jacob felt the catalyst thrum violently in his chest, urging him to act. "Spread out," Lyra shouted, her voice carrying over the chaos. She raised her staff, summoning a barrier of light to shield herself and Ella as they repositioned. Owen charged at the Warden, his new shield glowing faintly. The runes flared as he blocked another strike from the massive blade, but the impact sent him skidding back. "This thing is no joke," Owen yelled, regaining his footing. Ella darted forward, throwing one of her new knives. It streaked through the air, its shimmering edge aimed for the Warden's head. The shadowy figure moved with unnatural speed, catching the blade mid-flight and crushing it in its hand. "Is that all you've got?" the Warden taunted, its voice echoing ominously. Jacob gritted his teeth, the catalyst's energy building within him. He activated the pendant, focusing the power into his palms. A glowing sphere of light formed in his hands, its warmth cutting through the oppressive darkness of the chamber. "Not even close," Jacob said, hurling the sphere at the Warden. The light struck its chest, causing the Warden to stagger. Its form flickered, the shadows writhing as if in pain. "Good hit," Ella cheered, throwing another knife. This one embedded itself in the Warden's arm, eliciting a low growl. The Warden raised its blade, swinging it in a wide arc. A wave of dark energy surged toward the group, threatening to engulf them. "Get down," Lyra shouted, slamming her staff into the ground. A dome of light surrounded them, shielding them from the attack. The wave crashed against the barrier, shattering into fragments of shadow that dissipated into the air. "We can't keep defending forever," Lyra said, her voice strained. "We need to find its weakness." Jacob's mind raced as he studied the Warden. The catalyst pulsed again, drawing his attention to the swirling energy at the figure's core. It was faint but visible, a glowing heart of light amidst the shadows. "The core," Jacob shouted. "We have to hit its core." The others followed his gaze, spotting the faint glow. "Easier said than done," Owen muttered, raising his shield as the Warden advanced. Ella nodded, gripping her remaining knives. "We'll create an opening. Jacob, you take the shot." Jacob's hands glowed brighter as he prepared another energy sphere. The catalyst's power surged through him, stronger than before. Owen charged at the Warden, his shield absorbing another strike from the massive blade. The runes on the shield flared brightly, temporarily stunning the shadowy figure. "Now, Ella," Owen shouted. Ella sprinted forward, her movements a blur. She leapt into the air, spinning as she hurled her knives in rapid succession. Each blade struck the Warden's form, distracting it as Jacob focused his energy. "Lyra, help me aim," Jacob called. Lyra raised her staff, channeling her own energy into his. The sphere in Jacob's hands grew larger, its light intensifying. "Focus on the core," Lyra said, her voice calm and steady. The Warden roared, its form flickering as it swung wildly at Owen and Ella. Despite their agility, the sheer force of its attacks kept them on the defensive. "Jacob, now," Lyra shouted. With a deep breath, Jacob hurled the energy sphere toward the Warden. The light streaked through the air, piercing through the shadows and striking the glowing core. The chamber filled with a brilliant light as the warden let out a deafening scream. Its form collapsed inward, the shadows dissipating like smoke. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the faint hum of the catalyst. The group stood frozen, catching their breath. "Did we do it?" Owen asked cautiously, lowering his shield. The glow from the warden's core flickered, then faded completely. The towering figure was gone, leaving only a faint trace of energy in the air. "We did," Jacob said, the pendant around his neck dimming. Lyra approached the spot where the warden had stood, her expression thoughtful. "This was only a test," she said. "The Veil wanted to see if we were ready to face what lies ahead." Ella retrieved her knives, wiping them clean. "If that was just a test, I'm not looking forward to the real thing." Jacob clenched his fists, the catalyst pulsing faintly. "We're ready," he said, his voice firm. "Whatever's next, we'll face it together." The group gathered their things and moved forward, the chamber fading into the shadows behind them. The Veil's challenges weren't over, and the true battle was still ahead. Chapter 13. The Labyrinth of Veilstone. The path ahead wound into a narrow, twisting corridor, its walls covered in crystalline veins that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. The air grew colder with every step, and the faint sound of shifting stone echoed through the passage. "This place is alive," Lyra said, her voice low. "The Veilstone is reshaping itself." "Yeah, and not in a friendly way," Owen muttered, glancing at the walls. He gripped his shield tightly, his knuckles white. Ella threw a glance over her shoulder. "It's trying to confuse us. It wants to keep us off balance." Jacob felt the catalyst stir within him, a faint pull guiding him forward. The pendant around his neck pulsed in rhythm, its light soft but steady. "It's not just trying to confuse us," Jacob said. "It's testing me again. The catalyst is, it's showing me something. Care to share with the class?" Ella quipped, twirling one of her knives. Jacob hesitated, closing his eyes to focus on the energy. He saw flashes of a sprawling maze, its walls shifting and changing with every turn. At the center was something powerful, something calling to him. "It's a labyrinth," he said, opening his eyes. "There's something at the center. Something important." "Of course there is," Owen said with a sigh. "Because nothing's ever straightforward." The group pressed on, entering a vast chamber where the ground fell away into a maze of twisting corridors. The walls glowed faintly, their crystalline surfaces shifting like liquid. "This is it," Lyra said, her staff glowing softly. "The Labyrinth of Veilstone." "Great," Ella said, peering into the maze below. "And how exactly are we supposed to get through that?" Jacob took a deep breath, the catalyst pulsing stronger. "I think I can guide us, but I'll need your help." "Just tell us what to do," Owen said, stepping beside him. Jacob closed his eyes again, focusing on the catalyst's energy. He saw a path illuminated in his mind, glowing faintly among the shifting walls. "There's a path," he said. "But it's not stable. We have to move quickly, or the maze will trap us." "Then let's not waste time," Ella said, already heading toward the nearest corridor. The group descended into the labyrinth, the crystalline walls shimmering around them. Jacob led the way, the pendant and catalyst guiding him through the twisting passages. The maze shifted constantly, walls sliding into place and corridors disappearing behind them. Each step felt like a gamble, but Jacob's connection to the catalyst kept them moving forward. "Left here," he shouted, leading them around a corner just as the path behind them collapsed into darkness. "This thing is trying to crush us," Owen said, his voice tense. "Stay focused," Lyra said, her staff glowing brighter. "It's trying to overwhelm us, but we're stronger together." As they navigated the maze, strange creatures began to emerge from the walls. Shadowy figures with glowing eyes and jagged forms stepped into their path, their movements erratic and unnatural. "Looks like we've got company," Ella shouted, hurling a knife at the nearest creature. The blade struck true, but the figure dissolved into shadow and reformed moments later. "Great, they regenerate," Owen said, raising his shield. "Just what we needed." Jacob stepped forward, the catalyst flaring brightly. He focused its energy into a burst of light, driving back the creatures. They shrieked, retreating into the walls. "They're weak to light," Lyra said. "Keep them at bay while Jacob leads us through." The group moved quickly, fending off the shadowy creatures as they navigated the shifting maze. Jacob's energy grew fainter with each step, the strain of maintaining their path taking its toll. "We're close," he said, his voice strained. "Just a little farther." The maze shifted violently, walls collapsing and rising in rapid succession. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the creatures grew more aggressive, their attacks relentless. "Jacob, hurry," Ella shouted, slashing at a figure that lunged toward her. With a final surge of energy, Jacob guided them to a glowing doorway at the center of the maze. The light emanating from the doorway drove back the creatures, and the ground stabilized beneath them. "We made it," Owen said, panting. "Barely." Jacob collapsed to his knees, the catalyst dimming. Lyra knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did it," she said gently. "We're through." Jacob nodded, catching his breath. The group stepped through the doorway, leaving the labyrinth behind. On the other side, they found themselves in a circular chamber filled with swirling light. At the center was a pedestal, atop which rested a small, glowing crystal. "This is what the catalyst led us to," Jacob said, standing slowly. "What is it?" Ella asked, her voice filled with wonder. Lyra approached the pedestal, her expression serious. "It's a fragment of the Veil's core," she said. "A piece of the power we're here to stop." Jacob reached for the crystal, feeling the catalyst resonate strongly. As his hand closed around it, the chamber filled with light, and a voice echoed in his mind. "Bearer of the catalyst," the voice said. "You have proven yourself, but your journey is far from over. The true test awaits." The light faded, and the crystal fused with the catalyst, its energy surging through Jacob. "Looks like things just got a lot more complicated," Owen said, watching as the chamber began to shift around them. Jacob turned to his friends, determination in his eyes. "Then we'll face it together." With the crystal's power coursing through him, Jacob led the group forward, deeper into the Veil's mysteries. Chapter 14. The Echoes of the Past. The chamber around them began to shift once more, the walls bending and warping like liquid metal. Jacob held the glowing crystal in his hand, the energy pulsing through him, guiding them forward. As they walked, the surroundings morphed into something else entirely. The walls were now covered in ancient symbols, their glowing runes flickering with an eerie light. The floor beneath their feet was smooth, polished stone, and the air was thick with the scent of old magic. The sound of soft whispers filled the space, like voices from another time, reverberating off the stone. "This place feels different," Lyra murmured, her staff lighting the way. "It's as if the very air is alive with the past." Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The catalyst, now fused with the crystal, hummed softly within him, as if it sensed something lurking ahead. "Stay alert," Jacob warned, his grip tightening on the crystal. "Something's not right." As they ventured deeper into the chamber, a sudden shift in the air made the group pause. A low rumble echoed through the stone, and then the whispers grew louder, clearer. The voices seemed to be speaking in a language Jacob didn't understand, but the tone carried an unmistakable sense of urgency. "I don't like this," Owen said, his voice tense. He adjusted his shield, his eyes scanning the shadows. Ella, ever the fearless one, stepped forward. "We can't be afraid of some ghostly whispers. We've faced worse, right?" Just as she spoke, the whispers grew deafening, and the walls seemed to collapse inward. The group braced themselves, but the stone walls reformed into an arched doorway that opened before them, revealing a vast room beyond. The light from Lyra's staff flickered, casting long shadows across the stone floor. In the center of the room stood a towering figure, clad in robes that seemed to shimmer and change like liquid. The figure's face was hidden in shadow, but its presence was overwhelming, suffused with power. Jacob could feel the weight of its gaze, even though the figure didn't move. The voice echoed in Jacob's mind, louder this time, resonating with the energy of the veil itself. "The catalyst. You carry its burden now. But you are not the first." Jacob's heart raced. "Who are you?" he demanded. The figure stepped forward, its robes shifting like waves of the ocean. "I am a memory, a fragment of the past," it said. "I was once bound to the catalyst, just as you are. But unlike you, I failed." The words sent a chill down Jacob's spine. "Failed? How?" The figure raised its hand, and the chamber shifted once more, becoming a vision of a distant past. Jacob saw a great battle, a war between ancient forces, with the catalyst at the center of it all. Massive, shadowy beings clashed with radiant figures, and the Veilstone pulsed with an intensity Jacob had never felt before. The veil was not always a prison, the figure said, its voice tinged with regret. It was a source of power, a force that could have shaped the world. But its strength came at a cost. The vision shifted again, this time showing the figure's own face, young, determined, yet filled with sorrow. I was one of the last to carry the catalyst before it was sealed away. I failed in my mission, and the Veilstone became a prison for all who sought its power. Jacob felt a pang of sympathy for the figure. What happened? Why did you fail? The figure's shadowed face seemed to darken. I couldn't control the catalyst. Its power is too great, and the Veilstone is not meant to be wielded by any one person. I tried to use it to stop the war, to end the suffering. But the cost was too high. I sealed the catalyst away, hoping that no one else would make the same mistake. But now, you have come. Jacob's mind raced as he pieced together the fragments of history. So, the catalyst was meant to be destroyed. The figure nodded. Not destroyed, sealed. Its power cannot be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. But now that you carry it, the balance has been disrupted. Ella stepped forward, her usual confidence shaken. So what? You're telling us that Jacob shouldn't have it? That we've made a mistake by even coming here? The figure's gaze seemed to soften, if only slightly. No, you must understand. The catalyst is not evil, but its power is dangerous. It is a tool, not a weapon. It can heal the world, or it can shatter it. What you choose to do with it will determine the future. Jacob clenched his fists, the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. I didn't ask for this. But I'm not going to let it destroy me, or anyone else. The figure seemed to consider this for a moment before stepping back. Then you must make your choice, Jacob Torres. The path ahead will be fraught with trials, and not all of them can be overcome with strength. You must learn to wield the catalyst wisely, or risk repeating the mistakes of the past. The vision began to fade, and the figure's form blurred. Remember this. The veil is not just a prison, it is a test. And you are its final trial. As the last remnants of the figure dissolved into the air, the room shifted back to its original state. The whispers died down, leaving only silence. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. He was no closer to understanding the full scope of his mission, but one thing was clear, he couldn't do it alone. We have to keep going, Jacob said, his voice steady. We're not turning back now. Lyra nodded, her eyes filled with determination. We're with you, Jacob. Whatever comes next, we face it together. The group moved forward, the path ahead uncertain, but their resolve stronger than ever. The Veilstone's secrets were still hidden, but Jacob knew one thing for certain, the trials were far from over. Chapter 15. The Heart of the Veilstone. The air was thick with anticipation as the group pressed forward, the weight of the figure's words heavy on their minds. The chamber around them was eerily quiet now, the whispers gone, but the catalyst in Jacob's hand pulsed with a steady, almost comforting rhythm. It was as if it had become a part of him, its energy woven into the very fibers of his being. The path ahead was lined with more of the glowing runes, symbols that seemed to shift and change as they walked past. The walls of the Veilstone were alive, constantly shifting in response to their presence. But Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. There was someone else here, watching, waiting. Where are we going? Owen asked, his voice low. This place doesn't exactly scream, welcome. I don't know, Jacob admitted. But I think the catalyst is trying to tell me something. We have to keep moving forward. Ella raised an eyebrow. If we keep walking, we'll find the Veilstone's heart, right? You know, where all the answers are hidden. Something like that, Jacob replied, though he wasn't sure himself. The visions from the mysterious figure had left him with more questions than answers. The Veilstone, the catalyst, the war that had been fought, it was all too much to process. But the pull was undeniable. The catalyst was leading him somewhere, and he couldn't afford to ignore it. The group walked in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts, until they reached a large archway. Beyond it lay a vast, open space, the floor covered in an intricate pattern of glowing symbols. The walls here were different, less crystalline and more organic, with tendrils of glowing light that seemed to pulse with life. At the center of the room stood a massive pedestal, its surface carved with the same symbols that decorated the walls. Upon it rested a large, spherical object, its surface shifting and changing in a kaleidoscope of colors. The catalyst flared in Jacob's chest, its energy drawing him toward the pedestal. "This is it," Jacob said, his voice filled with awe. Lyra stepped forward, her staff glowing brightly. "The heart of the Veilstone," she whispered. "It's not just a physical object. It's a manifestation of the Veilstone's power. The source of everything." Jacob nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the object. As his fingers brushed the surface, the room seemed to ripple, and the symbols on the floor flared to life. A voice, deep and resonant, echoed through the chamber. "You seek the power of the Veilstone, but you are not yet ready." The ground beneath their feet trembled, and a wave of energy surged through the room. Jacob stepped back instinctively, feeling the energy push against him. The pedestal seemed to pulse, sending waves of light out into the room, and the air crackled with raw power. "We're being tested again," Owen said, his hand gripping his shield tightly. "What now?" Jacob's heart raced. The catalyst in his chest burned hotter than ever, its energy surging through him. The voice, though distant, still reverberated in his mind. "The Veilstone grants power, but at a cost. Only the worthy may control its energy. Prove yourselves, and you may wield the power to change the world." The chamber began to shift again, the symbols on the floor rearranging themselves into a new pattern. Jacob's mind was racing. This was the moment, the test the figure had warned him about. But what did it mean to be worthy? "What do we need to do?" Lyra asked, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. Jacob looked at the pedestal, then at his friends. He could feel the pull of the catalyst, guiding him toward the center of the room. The pattern on the floor had become a maze of interconnected symbols, each glowing brighter as they connected. "I think we need to complete the pattern," Jacob said, his voice filled with determination. "We have to connect the symbols. It's the only way to prove we're worthy." Ella glanced at the shifting patterns. "That sounds complicated." "It is," Jacob admitted. "But we don't have a choice." The energy in the room surged again, and the symbols on the floor began to move, shifting and changing in rapid succession. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that kept slipping out of place. "I need help," Jacob said, his voice strained. "Each of you needs to focus on one part of the pattern. We can't do this alone." Without hesitation, Lyra raised her staff, her eyes fixed on the glowing symbols. "I'll take the center." Owen stepped forward, his shield raised. "I've got the left side." Ella grinned, already moving to the right. "I'll handle the right. Let's make this work." Jacob took a deep breath and focused on the symbols in front of him. The catalyst pulsed with energy, guiding his movements, but it wasn't enough. The symbols were too complex, too fast. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with pressure. But then, a vision flashed before his eyes, an image of the war the figure had shown him earlier. The Veilstone's energy had been used recklessly, and it had torn the world apart. The pattern was a reflection of that chaos, and Jacob could feel the weight of that history pressing down on him. "Focus," Lyra shouted, her staff glowing brighter. "Don't lose it." Jacob gritted his teeth, narrowing his focus. He could feel the pieces coming together. The catalyst was reacting to him, its energy flowing through his veins. Slowly, the symbols began to lock into place, one by one. The energy in the room grew more intense, the pulsing light growing brighter as they worked in unison. Finally, with a burst of light, the last symbol clicked into place. The pedestal before them hummed with power, and the room fell silent. The symbols on the floor stopped shifting, the maze now complete. The voice echoed through the chamber once more, this time with a tone of approval. "You have proven yourselves. The Veilstone's power is now yours to wield, but be warned. Its energy can change the world, for better or for worse." The pedestal before them began to rise, revealing the core of the Veilstone, a glowing, pulsating orb. Jacob reached out, his hand trembling as he touched it. The moment his fingers made contact, a wave of energy surged through him, flooding his body with power. The catalyst flared in response, its light enveloping him. For a brief moment, Jacob felt like he was one with the Veilstone itself. He could see the threads of time, the currents of fate. He could feel the weight of the decisions yet to come. But then, as quickly as it had come, the vision faded. Jacob staggered back, gasping for air. The room around him had returned to its normal state, but the power within him remained. "We did it," he said breathlessly. "But what now?" The voice, now soft and distant, spoke again. "The Veilstone's heart has been awakened. Your journey is far from over. The trials will continue, and the fate of the world rests in your hands." The group exchanged uneasy glances. The heart of the Veilstone had been unlocked, but the path ahead was uncertain, fraught with dangers yet to come. Jacob could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. But he also felt something else, a newfound resolve. They had made it this far together, and they would face whatever came next as one. "Let's keep moving," Jacob said, his voice steady. "We've only just begun." Chapter 16. Shadows in the Depths. The energy from the Veilstone's heart still hummed within Jacob, his body buzzing with power, but it was different now, heavier, almost as if it had rooted itself deep within him. The air felt thicker, charged with an electric current that seemed to respond to his every move. "We did it," Owen said, his voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, still catching his breath. "But that wasn't as easy as I thought it'd be." "It wasn't supposed to be easy," Jacob replied, his eyes still fixed on the pedestal where the Veilstone's heart had once rested. Now, it was gone, and only the intricate, glowing patterns remained on the floor. "But I think this is only the beginning." Lyra nodded, her eyes narrowed. "I agree. We've awakened the Veilstone's power, but the voice said something about trials. I don't think we're free from this place yet." Jacob swallowed hard, trying to shake the feeling that the room wasn't as empty as it seemed. He could sense something lingering in the shadows, something watching them. "We should move forward," Ella said, her usual brash confidence returning. "The last thing we want is to stick around here longer than we have to." The group turned and began to move down the long corridor ahead, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The path was narrow, winding deeper into the heart of the Veilstone. The air grew cooler, the weight of the place pressing down on them as they ventured further. Suddenly, a low rumbling noise reverberated through the chamber, like the deep growl of some unseen creature. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. The catalyst within him flared, a warning, but of what? "What is that?" Owen whispered, his grip on his shield tightening. "I don't know," Jacob said, his voice strained. "But I have a feeling we're not alone." The rumbling grew louder, and the floor beneath their feet began to tremble. The walls shifted, and the corridor seemed to stretch and distort. Jacob's hand instinctively reached for the catalyst, trying to steady himself. Then, without warning, the ground cracked open in front of them, a deep chasm splitting the stone. A dark, shadowy figure emerged from the depths, rising like a phantom from the abyss. Its form was indistinct, swirling in and out of focus, but one thing was clear, it was not human. The shadows writhed around it, as if alive, and its eyes gleamed with an eerie red glow. "This isn't good," Lyra muttered, raising her staff defensively. "We need to get out of here." The creature, if it could be called that, let out a haunting, guttural growl, its form solidifying into a more defined shape. It was a tall, lanky figure, its limbs stretching unnaturally long. The shadows that surrounded it flickered like flames, creating an almost surreal, nightmare-like appearance. Jacob could feel the darkness radiating off it, thick and suffocating, the energy of the Veilstone's heart now being twisted into something malevolent. "We've awakened something," Jacob said, his voice tight with realization. "We've triggered the trial, and it's not going to let us leave." The creature lunged toward them with unnatural speed, its claws outstretched. It moved like liquid darkness, too fast to track, and in the blink of an eye, it was upon them. Ella was the first to react. She raised her arm, summoning a bolt of crackling energy from the air. It collided with the creature, sending sparks flying, but the creature barely flinched. Its shadowy form absorbed the energy, twisting around it like a whirlpool, then continued its advance. "It's immune to magic," Lyra shouted, backing away. "We need a different approach." Jacob's mind raced. The catalyst in his chest throbbed, reacting to the creature, but it wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed something that would break through the darkness. Without thinking, Jacob stepped forward, his hand outstretched, reaching for the shadows that surrounded the creature. For a moment, there was nothing but an overwhelming surge of energy, as though the very fabric of the Veilstone itself was responding to him. Then, the catalyst flared with blinding light. The darkness recoiled as the light from the crystal shot outward, pushing back against the creature, forcing it to hesitate. The creature screeched in fury, its form distorting as the light pressed against it. Jacob could feel the tension building in the air, the energy crackling with intensity. The catalyst was drawing on something deep within him, pulling from the very heart of the Veilstone. The creature's red eyes narrowed, and it let out another ear-piercing growl before lunging forward once more. But this time, Jacob was ready. He clenched his fists, focusing all of his willpower on the light radiating from the catalyst. With a shout, he thrust his hand forward, and the light burst outward, enveloping the creature. It screamed in agony as the light seared through the shadows, forcing it to dissipate in a burst of energy. The creature's form shattered, collapsing into a cloud of swirling darkness, which was quickly absorbed by the Veilstone. For a moment, the chamber was silent, the air still and thick with the remnants of the battle. The group stood frozen, staring at the spot where the creature had been. The darkness had receded, but the weight of the trial still lingered in the air. "That was too close," Owen muttered, lowering his shield. "What was that thing?" Jacob could only shake his head. "I don't know, but I think we've just scratched the surface of what the Veilstone holds. That creature was only a fraction of the power here. We need to keep moving. There are more trials to come." Lyra stepped forward, her expression grim. "The catalyst is changing you, Jacob. The power you just unleashed, it came from within you. Whatever this trial is, it's testing you, not just as a person, but as a bearer of the Veilstone's power." Jacob looked at his hand, still glowing faintly with energy. The weight of the catalyst was both a blessing and a curse. He had survived this trial, but the deeper they went, the harder the trials would become. "We don't have much time," Jacob said, his voice steady. "Let's keep going. The Veilstone isn't done with us yet." The group nodded, their resolve strengthened. They knew that the true test was only just beginning. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. And with that, they moved forward once more, into the shadows of the Veilstone's heart. Chapter 17. The Weight of Power. The walls of the Veilstone seemed to close in as Jacob and his team pressed onward. The path ahead grew narrower, the air thick with the echoes of their footsteps. The strange energy from the Veilstone pulsed like a living thing, and every step felt heavier than the last. The trials they had faced were only the beginning, and the pressure of the Veilstone's weight bore down on Jacob more than ever. "How much further do you think it is?" Ella asked, her voice strained. She had been keeping pace, but even her usual confidence was beginning to crack under the tension. "I don't know," Jacob replied, his eyes scanning the dark passageway ahead. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, as though the very air was warping around them. "But we need to be ready for anything. This place isn't like anything we've faced before." The catalyst burned against his chest, its heat seeping into his skin. It had become a part of him, its power intertwined with his own, and yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him. Something much larger than the creature they had fought earlier. "Do you feel that?" Lyra asked, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. She was walking slightly ahead, her staff glowing faintly as she guided them through the darkness. "The air, it's thick with something. Like it's alive." Jacob nodded, his hand tightening around the catalyst. "It's like the Veilstone is trying to test us, to see how far we'll go." As if to answer his words, the ground beneath their feet rumbled again, and a deep, resonating hum filled the chamber. The very walls seemed to vibrate, and the passageway ahead of them began to distort. It was as if the Veilstone was bending the world itself around them, warping space and time. "Not again," Owen shouted, raising his shield as though to defend them from the unseen threat. "What now?" Before anyone could respond, the ground cracked open before them, splitting wide in a flash of blinding light. A massive chasm formed, stretching far beyond what the eye could see. From the depths of the abyss, tendrils of shadow began to rise, winding up toward the group like serpents, each one moving with purpose and each one seemingly aware of their presence. Jacob felt a familiar, cold shiver run down his spine. These shadows were not like the creature they had faced earlier. They were something different, something older. "Stay close," Lyra commanded, raising her staff high, its light flaring brighter. "These aren't just shadows. They're manifestations of the Veilstone itself." Jacob's heart raced. He could feel the shadows pulling at him, trying to twist his mind, to break his will. The catalyst burned fiercely, its energy surging within him. But even with the power he had, he wasn't sure it would be enough to face this. The first tendril lunged, snapping through the air with terrifying speed. Jacob barely had time to react, but the catalyst flared once again, and a pulse of light shot from his chest, hitting the tendril squarely. The shadow recoiled, but only momentarily. "They're not stopping," Owen yelled, swinging his shield to deflect another tendril that was reaching for Lyra. "We need to fight back, but carefully," Lyra shouted. "The shadows are connected to the Veilstone's heart. If we destroy too many of them, we might trigger something worse." "Great," Ella muttered, pulling out her energy blade. "So we're supposed to fight these things without killing them." Jacob's mind raced. The shadows were dangerous, but Lyra was right, they couldn't just destroy them without consequence. The Veilstone's trials were connected to every step they took, and each choice they made would have consequences. "We need to sever the connection between the shadows and the Veilstone," Jacob said, his voice steady despite the fear building inside him. "If we can break that link, maybe we can stop them from attacking." "But how do we do that?" Owen asked, slashing at another tendril that was creeping toward him. "There's no clear way to sever something like that." Jacob's mind flashed to the catalyst, its light still blazing. If the power was truly tied to the Veilstone, then perhaps the catalyst was the key. He had to tap into its energy more directly, amplify the light that flowed through him, and use it to disrupt the shadowy connection. "I think I can do it," Jacob said, his voice firm. "But I need time. Hold them off for just a few moments." Ella and Owen nodded, springing into action. Lyra raised her staff, sending waves of light out to push back the tendrils, but they kept coming, each one more persistent than the last. Jacob focused, taking slow, steady breaths. The catalyst pulsed against his chest, its warmth spreading through him, and he reached deep inside, pulling on that energy. He could feel the light flowing through his veins, burning brighter, pushing against the darkness. But it was different this time. It felt like something was resisting him. "No," Jacob muttered, clenching his fists. "I won't let you stop me." The shadows seemed to laugh, a deep, echoing sound that reverberated through his mind. They twisted and writhed around him, and for a moment, he felt a flicker of doubt. But then the catalyst flared brighter than ever before, and Jacob's resolve solidified. He had come too far to turn back now. The Veilstone was testing him, yes, but it was also giving him the power he needed to survive. With a shout, Jacob thrust his hands forward, directing the energy of the catalyst outward. A burst of pure, blinding light exploded from him, engulfing the tendrils. The shadows recoiled in horror, their forms writhing violently as the light surged through them, unraveling the dark threads that connected them to the Veilstone. The room shook as the shadows screamed in agony, their forms unraveling in a flurry of dark smoke, dissipating into the air. The light from the catalyst burned brighter, filling the entire corridor with its glow, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the shadows were gone. The light dimmed, and Jacob collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. His body felt like it was on fire, the energy from the catalyst overwhelming him. "Jacob," Ella rushed to his side, helping him to his feet. "You did it, but you look like you're about to pass out." "I'm fine," Jacob said, his voice strained. He took a shaky breath. "Just need a second." Lyra stepped forward, her expression serious. "The Veilstone's trials are only going to get harder from here. What you just did was impressive, but you're running out of time. The deeper we go, the more dangerous this place becomes." Jacob nodded, his mind already preparing for what lay ahead. They had survived this trial, but there was no telling what the next one would bring. The Veilstone was far from done with them. "We're not turning back," Jacob said, his voice filled with determination. We finish what we started. With that, the group pressed on, deeper into the heart of the Veilstone. Chapter 18. The Heart of the Veilstone. The air grew even colder as Jacob and his team ventured deeper into the Veilstone's core. Every step seemed to echo in the vast, hollow expanse of the chamber ahead. The walls pulsed with a soft, ominous glow, their surface shifting and changing like liquid stone. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional sound of their boots scraping against the stone floor. Jacob could feel the weight of the Veilstone pressing down on him, each trial leaving him more drained, more uncertain of what was to come. The catalyst inside him burned with a relentless heat, but even its power couldn't shake the growing feeling of unease. "I don't like this," Owen muttered, looking around nervously. "This place feels like it's alive, like it's watching us." "I feel it too," Lyra said, her grip tightening on her staff. "This isn't just a structure. It's connected to something much older, something far more powerful than we can understand." "Then why are we still walking into the lion's den?" Ella shot back, a little less composed than usual. "We've faced shadows, we've faced trials, and we've barely survived. Why keep going?" Jacob glanced at his friends, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. He knew they were all questioning why they were still pressing forward. But there was something in him, something deeper than fear, that pushed him to keep going. "We have to finish this," Jacob said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm of doubt that raged inside him. "The Veilstone's power is too dangerous to leave unchecked. If we don't stop it, who knows what will happen to the world outside." Lyra nodded, her expression hardening. "He's right. Whatever happens, we have to see this through." They moved on, the path growing narrower and more treacherous. The temperature dropped even further, and a strange hum filled the air, an almost hypnotic resonance that seemed to vibrate through their bones. Jacob could feel the energy in the chamber swirling, warping around them, drawing them toward the heart of the Veilstone. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of walking, they arrived at the center of the chamber. The heart of the Veilstone was an immense, crystalline structure that hovered in the middle of the room, its surface shimmering with an ethereal glow. It was unlike anything Jacob had ever seen. Its edges seemed to shimmer, flicker, and pulse with the force of 1,000 stars. It was both beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, as though it contained the very essence of the universe within its core. "I knew it was going to be big," Owen whispered, eyes wide with awe. "But this is beyond anything I imagined." "We have to approach carefully," Lyra said, her voice low and cautious. "This is the source of all the trials. If we disrupt it in any way..." Before she could finish, a dark, low rumble reverberated through the room. The heart of the Veilstone began to glow brighter, the pulsing light intensifying. The air crackled with energy, and Jacob could feel the catalyst vibrating in his chest, as though it were reacting to the power of the heart. Suddenly, a deep, hollow voice echoed through the chamber, filling the air with an overwhelming presence. "You dare seek to control the heart of the Veilstone." The voice was like a thunderclap, shaking Jacob to his core. It was ancient, powerful, full of centuries of forgotten knowledge. It wasn't a voice that belonged to any living being, but rather something far older, something tied to the Veilstone itself. "We don't seek to control it," Jacob shouted, his voice barely rising above the rumble of the voice. "We seek to end the trials and stop the Veilstone's power from destroying everything." The glowing heart pulsed in response, its light flickering like the beating of a heart. Then, the voice spoke again, colder and more furious. "You are fools. The trials are but a glimpse of the true power within. The Veilstone cannot be stopped. It will be your undoing, just as it was for those who came before you." Jacob's stomach twisted. He had feared something like this, something far beyond what they had imagined. The Veilstone wasn't just a test. It was an ancient force, beyond the comprehension of any mortal. "What is it you want from us?" Jacob demanded, stepping forward. He felt the catalyst surge, as though it wanted to answer, to prove its power. But he resisted, forcing the energy to settle, to remain under control. The voice laughed, a sound like the rumbling of distant thunder. "What I want is simple. I want to see if you are worthy. If you can truly bear the weight of the Veilstone's power, or if you will break like all those before you." Jacob clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the words. He could feel the pressure building inside him, the catalyst burning brighter. This was the final trial, the true test of whether he could harness the Veilstone's power without being consumed by it. He could see it now. The Veilstone's power was a double-edged sword. It could save the world, or it could destroy it. It was a force that could change everything, but only if he was strong enough to wield it. "I'm not backing down," Jacob said, his voice filled with conviction. "We've come this far. We'll face whatever comes next. We won't let the Veilstone destroy us." The heart of the Veilstone pulsed again, its light brighter than ever. The voice spoke one last time, filled with an eerie finality. "Very well. If you are to continue, you must prove your strength. You will face the true trial of the Veilstone, and only then will you know if you are worthy." A sharp, violent pulse of energy shot out from the heart, hitting Jacob squarely in the chest. He staggered back, the force knocking the breath out of him. His vision blurred, and his head swam with the intensity of the power flowing through him. "We're not ready," Ella cried, but her voice sounded distant. Jacob barely registered her words. The catalyst surged within him, and he could feel his connection to the Veilstone growing deeper. The energy was suffocating, overwhelming. His body screamed in protest, but he fought to maintain control. "I have to do this," Jacob whispered to himself, his voice strained. The energy around him swirled, twisting, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. Then, a massive shadow loomed before them, something far darker than the trials they had already faced. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest, and he knew one thing with certainty: this was only the beginning. He took a deep breath, his hand tightening around the catalyst. "Let's finish this." The shadows lunged toward him, and the final trial began. Chapter 19. The Final Trial. Jacob's heart raced as the shadows surged toward him. His vision was clouded by the overwhelming presence of the Veilstone's energy. The pulse from the heart had left him reeling, but it was nothing compared to the force of the trial that was now upon him. The massive shadow that loomed before them twisted and shifted, its form ever changing, as though it were the embodiment of all the darkness that had been left in the world. It was not a single entity but a chaotic amalgamation of every fear, doubt, and uncertainty that Jacob had ever felt. Its very existence seemed to mock him, taunting him with the impossible task ahead. The ground beneath Jacob's feet cracked, and the Veilstone's energy swirled around him, making it hard to breathe. He could feel it all: the weight of the catalyst, the pressure of the Veilstone, and the anticipation of what was to come. But there was something else too, a whisper, faint but persistent, that tugged at the edges of his mind. "Are you truly ready for this, Jacob? Can you bear the burden of the Veilstone?" He tried to block out the voice, but it seemed to permeate every part of his being. The power of the Veilstone was trying to consume him, to pull him under, and Jacob felt himself faltering for the briefest moment. He had come so far, but could he handle the weight of it all? "Jacob," Ella's voice broke through his thoughts. "Don't listen to it, we're with you." He blinked, and for a second, the room seemed to shift. The shadow before them pulsed, its form growing larger, and the air grew colder, thicker, until it was suffocating. Jacob's pulse quickened, but he pushed aside the doubts clouding his mind. The catalyst was still burning against his chest, its light cutting through the darkness. His connection to it was stronger than ever, and he knew he had to focus. There was no turning back now. With a surge of energy, Jacob stepped forward, the catalyst flaring with blinding light as he raised his hands toward the shadow. He didn't know exactly what he was doing, but he knew one thing: he had to stand firm, no matter what. The power inside him was growing, but with it came the risk of losing himself. "Together," Lyra shouted, her voice filled with urgency. She raised her staff, and a bolt of light shot forward, striking the shadow. The tendrils of darkness recoiled, but the shadow didn't dissipate. It seemed to absorb the light, growing stronger. "We can't stop it like this," Owen yelled, his sword swinging at the shadow's edges, but it was like striking smoke. His attacks passed through with no effect. "It's too strong." Jacob could feel the weight of the shadow pressing in on him, its presence suffocating, and the whispering voice in his mind growing louder, more insistent. "You are not ready, Jacob. You never were." His breath hitched, the cold seeping into his bones. The power of the Veilstone was testing him, pushing him beyond his limits. He could feel the edges of his control slipping. It would be so easy to let go, to allow the power to consume him completely. But then, something clicked. Jacob remembered why he had come this far. The people who relied on him, the bonds he had forged with his friends, those were the things that mattered. Not the power, not the Veilstone, but the people who cared about him and the world that needed saving. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, grounding himself. He wouldn't let this shadow consume him. He wouldn't let the Veilstone break him. With a cry, Jacob thrust his hands forward, channeling every ounce of energy from the catalyst into the darkness. Light exploded from him, piercing through the shadow, unraveling its form. The shadow writhed, but it could not withstand the sheer intensity of the light. The tendrils shrieked in agony as they dissolved into nothingness, and the massive shadow began to crumble, breaking apart into a million flickering fragments. But even as the shadow began to fade, the voice spoke once more, cold and mocking. "You have won this battle, Jacob Torres. But do you truly believe you have defeated the Veilstone?" Jacob's breath caught in his throat as he looked up, the heart of the Veilstone pulsing ominously once again. Something in the air had changed. It was heavier, more foreboding. Before Jacob could respond, the ground beneath them trembled once more. A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the chamber, and the entire structure began to shake. Cracks formed in the walls, and the floor buckled, sending tremors through the room. The Veilstone was fighting back. "Get ready," Lyra shouted, her staff glowing brightly. "This isn't over." Jacob felt a surge of panic, but he forced it down. They had come too far to be defeated now. They had to finish this, no matter what the Veilstone threw at them next. The walls around them split open, and from the cracks, vast tendrils of energy shot forth, spiraling toward them like lightning. Jacob could feel the heat of the Veilstone's wrath as the energy closed in. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold it back. "Hold steady," Owen shouted, his sword raised high, ready to defend. "We can't let it destroy us now." But the energy wasn't just an attack, it was something far more sinister. It was as if the very essence of the Veilstone was coming alive, seeking to consume them all. The power radiated from every direction, and it was overwhelming. Jacob reached for the catalyst, feeling its pulse quicken beneath his skin. It was time to push through, to use everything he had learned on this journey. "I won't let it win," Jacob said, his voice determined. "We're finishing this, together." And with that, he called upon the full strength of the catalyst, his entire being channeling its power as the final trial loomed ahead. The battle for the Veilstone's heart was far from over. Chapter 20. The Unraveling. The energy from the Veilstone lashed out like a storm, crackling through the air with blinding intensity. Jacob's heart hammered in his chest, the weight of the power pushing against his mind, threatening to overwhelm him. Every nerve screamed for release, but he clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. The catalyst burned fiercely within him, its warmth spreading through his veins, but it was not enough. "Not yet. Jacob, we have to stay together," Lyra shouted, her voice strained against the overwhelming pressure. She was struggling to maintain control of her staff, her body trembling under the weight of the energy. "Hold on," Owen called, standing next to Lyra, his sword glowing brightly as he swung it at the tendrils of dark energy that tried to wrap around them. But the more they fought, the more the Veilstone retaliated. Every strike was met with an equal, if not stronger, counterattack. Jacob's mind raced. There had to be something they were missing, something more than just raw power. He had seen it before, the connection between the Veilstone and the catalyst. It wasn't just about fighting against the darkness, it was about understanding it. The energy from the Veilstone surged again, tearing through the room in a violent burst. Jacob staggered backward, falling to his knees as the force of it slammed into him. The room seemed to spin, and for a moment, everything blurred. "No, I can't let it control me," he thought, gasping for air. "I won't give in." Then, just as suddenly as the attack came, the energy halted, and the room went deathly silent. Jacob blinked, his vision clearing. He looked up to see the heart of the Veilstone glowing brighter than ever before. The energy that had been surrounding them was now coiling around the heart, drawn toward its core like a moth to a flame. And that was when Jacob understood. The Veilstone wasn't just a force to be reckoned with. It was a conduit. A bridge between worlds, between powers that had long been forgotten. And it was seeking to merge with the catalyst, to combine its destructive energy with the very essence that Jacob had come to control. He looked at his friends. Lyra, Owen, and Ella were still reeling, but they hadn't given up. They were still fighting, still standing beside him. "We need to stop it," Jacob said, his voice grim. "If we don't, it'll merge with the catalyst, and it will be the end of everything." Lyra's eyes widened in realization. So that's what it's been trying to do. It's been trying to find its perfect match. The catalyst. But how do we stop it? Owen asked, wiping sweat from his brow as he glanced at the swirling energy. "We're running out of time. We have to destroy the connection," Jacob said. "We have to sever it." The room rumbled again, this time with even more force. The walls cracked wider, and the floor beneath them began to split open. The Veilstone was reacting to their realization, its power flaring in an uncontrollable spiral. "I can't fight it off anymore," Ella yelled, her eyes wide with panic. "It's too strong." Jacob felt the catalyst flare with renewed intensity. It was the answer. He had to tap into the full potential of the catalyst, to understand its connection to the Veilstone. The Veilstone's power was destructive, yes, but it was also ancient, imbued with knowledge, with creation. And the catalyst, it was born of the same force, a weapon designed to balance that power. Jacob stood, his body trembling with effort. His hand hovered over the catalyst, and he reached out, feeling its pulse echoing within him. The power surged in waves, and Jacob could feel the Veilstone trying to pull him into its depths, trying to consume him. But he wasn't afraid anymore. He understood it now. The energy from the Veilstone lashed out, and Jacob held his ground. He could feel it testing him, probing for weakness, but he refused to give in. "Together," Jacob said, his voice steady. "We have to do this together." Lyra stepped forward first, her staff glowing bright as she called upon her magic. "I'm with you," she said, her voice strong. "Let's end this." Owen and Ella nodded, standing alongside him, their weapons raised. The energy from the Veilstone crackled around them, but they stood united, drawing on the power of their bond. With a deep breath, Jacob raised his hands, and the catalyst flared with blinding light. The Veilstone screamed in fury, its dark energy swirling around the room, seeking to drown them in its power. But Jacob was no longer fighting against it. He was embracing it. The catalyst and the Veilstone were two halves of the same whole, and he understood now that in order to stop it, he had to become one with it. "Now!" Jacob shouted. The light from the catalyst exploded outward, colliding with the Veilstone's energy. The room shook violently, the floor cracking open beneath them. But Jacob held his ground, the power of the catalyst surging through him like a storm. The two forces collided with a deafening roar, and for a moment, everything went dark. When the darkness cleared, Jacob found himself standing in the center of a vast, empty void. He was alone. There was no sign of his friends, no sign of the Veilstone. It was as if the world had been erased. In the distance, a flickering light appeared. Jacob's heart raced as he walked toward it, the void stretching endlessly before him. As he approached, he saw a figure standing in the light. It was a woman, her features blurred and indistinct. But she was familiar. Jacob felt a strange sense of recognition, as if he had known her his whole life. The woman looked at him with sad, knowing eyes. "Jacob," she said, her voice echoing in the void. "You've made a choice, but it is not over yet. The Veilstone's power is not easily undone." Jacob took a step forward, his voice trembling. "What do you mean? Is it gone? Have we stopped it?" The woman's expression softened, but her gaze remained distant. "The Veilstone is not something that can be destroyed. It is eternal. But you, Jacob Torres, have proven something greater than its power. You have proven that there is more to you than the darkness. But the trials are not over. This is just the beginning." The light around the woman began to flicker, fading with every word she spoke. "No," Jacob cried, reaching out. "Please, tell me what to do. How do I stop this?" But the woman's figure began to vanish, her words the last thing left in the void. "The true trial awaits you, Jacob. The Veilstone will find its way back. But you will face it again. And when you do, you must be ready." And with that, the void collapsed around Jacob, and he was thrust back into the chamber of the Veilstone, surrounded by darkness. The trial had only just begun. Chapter 21. The Awakening. Jacob's chest heaved as the echoes of the woman's words reverberated in his mind. The vast void around him had faded in an instant, returning him to the darkened chamber of the Veilstone. His hands were still crackling with residual energy from the explosion of light, but the weight of the power felt different now. As though it were waiting. Jacob. Lyra's voice broke through his dazed thoughts. Are you okay? He blinked, his vision clearing, and found Lyra, Owen, and Ella standing nearby, their expressions a mix of relief and concern. The energy around them had subsided, the frantic storm of Veilstone's power retreating into the depths of the chamber. I think so, Jacob said, his voice hoarse. But it's not over, is it? Ella shook her head. No, that much is clear. The Veilstone's power, it's still alive. Jacob's heart sank as he looked around. The chamber that had once been filled with violent energy now seemed eerily still, as though the Veilstone itself were waiting, holding its breath. But there was something different now, something that felt darker, more pervasive. What do we do now? Owen asked, his brow furrowed as he scanned the room. Jacob took a deep breath, forcing the panic down. The image of the woman in the void, her cryptic words lingering in his mind, was impossible to shake. The trials are not over. The Veilstone will find its way back. I don't know, Jacob admitted. But I know one thing for sure, it's not over. The Veilstone isn't finished with us. He could feel it in the air, the same oppressive weight that had been building all along. The Veilstone was not just a source of power, it was a force, ancient and unyielding, and it would find its way back to them, just as the woman had warned. We need to figure out how to stop it once and for all, Lyra said, her voice firm. And we need to do it before it can destroy everything. Jacob nodded. He knew the stakes had never been higher, but the path ahead felt more uncertain than ever. They had come so far, and yet, it seemed they were only beginning to uncover the true depth of the Veilstone's power. Suddenly, the room shook again, and a low, rumbling growl filled the air. The stone beneath their feet cracked and shifted, and Jacob instinctively stepped forward, his hand going to the catalyst. What's happening? Owen asked, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword. It's starting, Jacob said quietly, his eyes narrowing. The Veilstone was stirring, reacting to their presence in the chamber. And this time, it wasn't just a passive force, it was fighting back. The heart of the Veilstone pulsed, sending ripples of dark energy throughout the room. The chamber began to twist and warp, the walls cracking as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. We need to leave, now, Ella shouted, but it was too late. The walls began to close in, and the air grew thick with an unnatural force, as if the entire chamber were collapsing inward. Jacob gritted his teeth, reaching out toward the catalyst, its energy pulsing stronger than ever. He could feel the weight of the Veilstone's presence pushing against him, testing him, just as it had in the void. This was the true trial. He couldn't stop it alone, but he couldn't let it break them either. Not after everything they had fought for. The walls trembled violently, and the chamber began to disintegrate around them, the stone crumbling into dust. Jacob turned to his friends, fear flashing in their eyes as they realized the gravity of the situation. We have to hold on, Jacob said, his voice unwavering despite the chaos around them. Together. Suddenly, the Veilstone's heart erupted with an ear-splitting screech, sending a shockwave through the room. Jacob was thrown backward, the energy from the Veilstone crashing into him like a tidal wave. His body was slammed into the wall, and for a moment, everything went black. When Jacob came to, he found himself lying in a strange, unfamiliar landscape. The ground beneath him felt soft, almost dreamlike, and the air was thick with a heavy, ethereal mist. He pushed himself to his feet, his body sore from the blast, and looked around. The world around him was not like the chamber they had just left. This was something else entirely, a realm of shifting shadows and shifting light, as if reality itself was bending and warping. In the distance, a glowing tower stood against the mist, its silhouette flickering as though it were made of pure light and dark, constantly changing. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him. The Veilstone had transported them. He didn't know how or why, but they had been taken to a different plane, somewhere beyond the world they knew. Lyra, Owen, Ella, he called, but his voice seemed to disappear into the mist. The landscape stretched out endlessly in every direction, no sign of his friends or any clue as to what was happening. He tried to focus, feeling the pulse of the catalyst within him. It was still alive, still calling to him, but the energy was muted, distant, as though the Veilstone was interfering with it. The ground beneath him shifted again, and Jacob's eyes widened as he saw something moving toward him through the mist. It was a figure, cloaked in shadow, its face hidden beneath a hood. As it approached, the air grew colder, and Jacob could feel the oppressive weight of the figure's presence. The figure stopped in front of him, and Jacob could barely make out the whisper of words coming from beneath the hood. "You have come far, Jacob Torres. But this is where the true test begins." Before Jacob could respond, the figure raised a hand, and the mist around them began to swirl, darkness closing in like a tightening noose. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, leaving Jacob standing in the shifting shadows, the weight of its words hanging in the air. Jacob's mind raced. He had no idea what was happening or what this place was, but one thing was certain: this was not over. Not by a long shot. The Veilstone was not done with him. Chapter 22. The Echoes of the Veilstone. The mist pressed in on all sides, an unyielding shroud that seemed to stretch on forever. Jacob's breath quickened, and the chill in the air nipped at his skin. Every step he took felt as though he was wading through a thick, invisible sea, his movements sluggish, as if the very air was trying to pull him down. He had to find his friends. The figure in the shadows had been clear: this is where the true test begins. But what did that mean? What kind of trial awaited him here, in this place that defied logic and space? Suddenly, a sharp sound cut through the air, a crackling noise, like thunder rolling through the sky, though there was no sky here. No stars, no sun. Just the ever-shifting fog and the sense that the ground beneath his feet might collapse at any moment. Jacob's heart skipped a beat as a shape materialized in the mist ahead of him. It wasn't human, nor was it anything he could easily describe. It was a dark silhouette, tall, elongated, and unnervingly still. "Jacob Torres," a voice echoed, low and distorted. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating through the very air around him. "You think you understand the power of the Veilstone. But you have only scratched the surface." Jacob tensed, instinctively reaching for the catalyst, but the energy felt muted here. Far away, as if the Veilstone had already begun to suppress its influence over him. "What do you want from me?" Jacob shouted, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. "Where are my friends?" The figure's head tilted slightly, as if contemplating his words. "You seek your friends, but they are not here. Not in the way you think. They are lost, just as you are." Jacob's breath hitched. "What do you mean, lost? What have you done with them?" "Nothing," the figure replied. "But they are not your true trial. They never were." The mist around Jacob swirled more violently, and the ground trembled beneath him. He staggered, his footing unsteady, and tried to make sense of what the figure had just said. "They are not your true trial." That didn't make sense. Lyra, Owen, Ella, they had all fought alongside him. He couldn't believe they weren't part of the reason he was here. "Then what is my true trial?" Jacob demanded, feeling the heat of the catalyst flare up in him, as if sensing the urgency of the situation. The figure's presence seemed to intensify. It stepped forward, and though its face was hidden, Jacob could feel its gaze, cold, judging, and omnipotent. "You are the trial," the figure whispered. "The Veilstone chose you because of what you are. You think you can wield its power, but it is not so easily controlled. It is a force that consumes, that twists, that bends all things to its will. And you, Jacob Torres, are the last line between it and the world you seek to protect." Jacob swallowed hard. The figure was right, in a way. He had been chosen, but why? Was it really because of the catalyst inside him? The woman in the void had said there was more to him than the darkness. But this felt different. There was something ancient and terrifying in the figure's words, something that told him he wasn't just fighting against the Veilstone. He was fighting against his own nature, too. "Why me?" Jacob whispered, the weight of the question pressing down on him. "What makes me different?" The figure did not answer immediately. Instead, it extended a long, spindly arm, and a swirl of dark energy appeared in front of Jacob. It was a vision, images flashing quickly, too fast for him to fully understand, but they were clear enough to shake him to his core. He saw himself, as a child, standing before a vast, swirling mass of energy. A storm of fire and light, and standing in the midst of it all, was the Veilstone, shining with an unnatural glow. Then, the vision shifted. He was older now, surrounded by darkness. He could feel the pull of something deep within him, a hunger, a thirst. A yearning to dominate. He could feel the catalyst, too, its power calling to him, urging him to take control. And then, the most unsettling vision of all, the Veilstone, not just as a force, but as a living entity. A being of infinite darkness, with eyes that saw through time, through space. It had chosen him to do something Jacob couldn't quite understand. Jacob staggered back, gasping for breath, his pulse racing. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "That's not who I am. I'm not a weapon." The figure's voice was a low, mocking whisper. "But you are. Whether you wish it or not, you have already begun to wield the Veilstone's power. Its call is in you. You are marked by it, Jacob Torres. And you cannot outrun that fate." Jacob clenched his fists, fighting the urge to let the power of the catalyst consume him. He wouldn't give in. Not like this. Not to something that wanted to twist him into its tool. "I will fight it," Jacob said, his voice strong despite the weight of the vision still pressing against him. "I won't let it control me." The figure's form flickered, and for a moment, it seemed to smile, a cold, cruel smile. "You may resist now, but it will only grow stronger. The Veilstone is a force unlike any other. It will consume you, just as it has consumed all those who have come before you." Before Jacob could respond, the mist began to churn violently again, the ground beneath him shaking with renewed intensity. The figure's form began to dissipate, as if it were becoming part of the very air. "You will understand soon enough," it said, its voice fading. "When the trials are over, the truth will be revealed." Then, everything went dark. Jacob's eyes shot open, and he found himself back in the chamber with the Veilstone. The catalyst hummed weakly within him, but the oppressive weight of the mist and the vision still lingered. He could feel the dark presence of the Veilstone all around him, like a cold shadow pressing against his every thought. But he was alive, and that meant there was still a chance. "I can't give in," Jacob told himself. "I have to find my friends." He wasn't sure how much time had passed, but the chamber felt different now, quieter. The Veilstone's power had lessened, but it was still present, still waiting for him to make the next move. But the figure's words haunted him. The truth will be revealed. Was he truly the key to the Veilstone's power? Could he really stop it? The answer was out there, somewhere, and Jacob Torres would find it. Chapter 23, The Fractured Path. The chamber around Jacob was silent now, save for the faint hum of the catalyst embedded in his chest. The weight of what had just happened still lingered heavily on his mind. The cryptic figure, the visions, and the unsettling words, "You are marked by it." The Veilstone was no longer just a distant threat, it was a part of him. Its influence was growing, and Jacob could feel it, like a pulse under his skin, urging him forward, urging him to embrace it. But he couldn't. Not like that. With a steadying breath, he pushed himself to his feet. The room was different now. The once oppressive mist had cleared, leaving only the cold stone walls and the pulsing light of the Veilstone in the center. It seemed almost calm, as if waiting for him to make his next move. The catalyst buzzed softly in his chest, an ever-present reminder of the power he wielded. "I need to find my friends," Jacob muttered to himself, his voice breaking the stillness. "I can't do this alone." He moved toward the center of the room, where the Veilstone's glow grew brighter with every step he took. The power it emitted was intoxicating, like a drug he couldn't resist, pulling at him, beckoning him to come closer. The temptation was overwhelming, and for a moment, Jacob hesitated. Just one step closer, one more taste of its power, the whisper inside his mind urged. But Jacob clenched his fists, shaking his head. "No, I won't give in." He turned away from the Veilstone, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand, finding Lyra, Owen, and Ella. They were out there, somewhere, lost in this strange world with him. He couldn't lose them. not when they were his only chance at stopping whatever the Veilstone was planning. As Jacob walked through the chamber, the walls seemed to shift around him, the stone twisting and warping, as if the very architecture of the place was alive. The air grew colder with each step, and he felt an oppressive weight press down on him. This was no longer just a trial. It was something more, a twisted game played by an entity far older than he could comprehend. Suddenly, a movement caught his eye, a flicker of shadow darting across the far wall. Jacob froze, instinctively reaching for the catalyst. His pulse quickened as he narrowed his eyes, watching the shadow move again, closer this time. It was no longer just an illusion. Something, or someone, was in the room with him. "Who's there?" Jacob called out, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. No answer. The shadow paused, then darted again, faster this time. Jacob took a cautious step forward, his hand still gripping the catalyst. The glow of the stone in his chest brightened in response to the growing tension, as if it sensed the impending confrontation. Out of nowhere, the figure appeared before him, a man, or something resembling one, cloaked in tattered robes. His face was hidden beneath a deep hood, and his entire presence radiated an unsettling aura, like the air around him became thick and heavy. Jacob's heart skipped a beat as the figure's eyes glowed, faintly visible beneath the shadow of his hood. "You are not meant to be here," the figure said, his voice cold and rasping, like the wind through dead trees. "But now that you are, you must face what lies ahead." Jacob squared his shoulders. He wasn't afraid, not anymore. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted his head, his glowing eyes narrowing. "I want nothing from you, Jacob Torres. But the Veilstone, it calls to you, as it called to many before you." Jacob felt the catalyst stir in his chest. "The Veilstone calls to me," the words echoed in his mind, a repetition of the vision he had seen earlier. It was not just power it sought, but something else. Something Jacob hadn't yet fully understood. "You're here because of the Veilstone, aren't you?" Jacob said, stepping closer, his gaze hardening. "You know what it's capable of. You know what it wants from me." The figure gave a hollow laugh, the sound grating in the quiet of the chamber. "What the Veilstone wants is beyond you, child. But you have a role to play. One you cannot escape." Jacob's thoughts raced. He had come so far, fought so hard to understand the Veilstone's true nature, but now it seemed like everything was slipping through his fingers. His mind flashed to the visions, the glimpses of the Veilstone's destructive power, its connection to him, to his very essence. It wasn't just a weapon or a force, it was something more. It was alive. "You think you can control it," the figure continued, his voice like a jagged blade in Jacob's chest. "But you are mistaken. You are nothing more than a pawn. And the Veilstone will use you until there is nothing left of you but its will." Jacob's fists clenched. "I'm not a pawn. I'm not going to let it control me." The figure's eyes burned brighter for a moment, and a cold, unnatural wind swept through the room. "Then you will fail, just like all those before you." With a final, mocking chuckle, the figure vanished, leaving Jacob standing alone in the chamber once more. His mind was racing, the figure's words sinking deeper into his thoughts. A pawn. Could that be true? Was he really just a tool to be used by the Veilstone? The thought made him sick to his stomach, but he couldn't afford to let it consume him. He had to stay focused. He had to find his friends. But just as he began to move forward, a sharp pain erupted in his chest, radiating from the catalyst. Jacob gasped, clutching at his chest as the energy surged through him. It was unlike anything he had ever felt, sharp, burning, consuming. He fell to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "No, not like this. I won't give in." The pain intensified, and for a moment, Jacob thought he might lose consciousness. But then, a voice, familiar, yet distant, cut through the chaos. "Jacob, hold on." It was Lyra's voice. His eyes snapped open, and he could see her. No, he felt her presence. She was out there. She was real. "Lyra," Jacob rasped, his voice barely audible over the sound of his pounding heartbeat. "Yes, we're coming." Lyra's voice grew clearer, more focused, though the distance between them seemed vast. "Just hold on." Jacob pushed through the pain, his hand still gripping the catalyst. He had to stay focused. He couldn't let the Veilstone win. Not now. Not when he was this close. The connection to Lyra was growing stronger, and with it, the pull of something deeper, something more primal, more instinctive. The Veilstone was calling to him again, but this time, it wasn't just the catalyst responding. It was him. The choice had always been his. Would he give into the darkness, or would he rise above it? Suddenly, the room trembled violently, and the Veilstone flared to life once more, the darkness thickening around him. Jacob knew now. The true trial was just beginning. Chapter 24. The Abyss Awaits. Jacob's vision blurred, his mind reeling from the intense surge of power coursing through him. He could feel it, the catalyst burning against his chest, thrumming with energy that seemed to reach out, pulling him into the heart of the Veilstone's darkness. The room around him seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own, as though the walls themselves were alive, alive with the very essence of the Veilstone. The pain in his chest had faded, but in its place was a creeping cold, an overwhelming sense of isolation. He was no longer just a boy, he was something else, something more. The connection to the Veilstone was undeniable. It was a force he could not ignore, a power that pulsed within him, demanding his attention. Lyra's voice, she's still out there. Jacob clung to that thought, the only anchor in a storm of chaos. He had to find her. He had to find Owen and Ella too. He couldn't let them face this alone. The Veilstone was powerful, but it didn't have to win. I won't let you control me, Jacob whispered fiercely to the dark around him. The air crackled, the oppressive weight of the chamber pressing in on him. Jacob's breathing was shallow, the cold gnawing at his bones. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to twitch and writhe, like something alive and watching. The voice from before, "You are nothing more than a pawn," echoed in his mind, a reminder of what he had just faced, a reminder of what was at stake. But Jacob wasn't a pawn. Not anymore. He stood tall, even as his legs threatened to give way beneath him. The energy in his chest surged once more, this time under his control. He felt it. He could feel it deep within, thrumming in sync with his heartbeat. The power was his, but so was the choice. I control this, Jacob thought, summoning every ounce of strength within himself. He took a step forward, determined. With each movement, the darkness seemed to recoil, like it couldn't touch him. The more he embraced his power, the more the Veilstone seemed to push against him, as though it knew that he might actually be capable of resisting it. Suddenly, there was a rumble beneath his feet, and the floor cracked open, a jagged line splitting the stone in two. The ground trembled violently, and Jacob stumbled, falling to one knee as the dark energy surged outward in waves. From the crack in the earth, shadows rose like tendrils, twisting and lashing at the air. Jacob, Lyra's voice called again, clearer this time, almost as if she were right beside him. We're coming. Just stay strong. Her words lit a spark in Jacob's chest. He wasn't alone. He couldn't afford to be alone. He reached out with his senses, following the pull of her voice, the warmth of her presence. Lyra, he shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. But the darkness only grew heavier, and the shadows around him writhed, blocking his path. He felt the cold of the Veilstone threatening to pull him back, to drag him into the void from which there was no return. Fight it, Jacob, you're not alone. The voice, this time, was his own strength pushing through the veil of fear. He could feel the others, Ella, Owen, close. He could feel them, their presence like faint beacons in the overwhelming darkness. The shadows lashed out again, faster this time, but Jacob was ready. He summoned the energy from the catalyst, pushing the shadows back with a burst of radiant light that filled the room. The darkness hissed and shrieked, recoiling from the light as though it were acid to its very form. But the crack in the floor widened, and a new presence emerged from the depths, something far older, far more dangerous. It loomed above Jacob, an enormous, towering figure made of the very darkness he had been fighting. Its eyes burned with an unholy fire, and its voice, when it spoke, was like the grinding of stone. You think you can defy me, child? The creature's voice was deep, resonating in Jacob's bones. You are nothing. The Veilstone is eternal. You are but a fleeting moment in its endless cycle. Jacob gritted his teeth, his heart pounding in his chest. The creature before him was unlike anything he had ever faced. It was ancient, its very form an embodiment of the darkness and the Veilstone's power. Yet, even in the face of it, Jacob stood tall, unyielding. "I won't let you win," Jacob said, his voice firm despite the terror that coiled around his heart. "You don't control me. I choose my own path." The creature laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that filled the entire chamber. "You are a fool. The Veilstone chooses, and you will bow before it, just as all who came before you have." Jacob's eyes narrowed. He could feel the power of the Veilstone thrumming through him, urging him to give in, urging him to accept its darkness. But deep within, he felt the presence of his friends, of Lyra, of Owen, of Ella, and their voices seemed to rise above the creature's words, drowning out the darkness. "You don't control me," Jacob repeated, his voice louder, stronger this time. "The Veilstone may be powerful, but it doesn't define me. I define myself." The air around him shifted, and the catalyst flared with light, blinding the creature before him. The ground shook, and for a moment, the room seemed to split apart. The creature roared in fury, but Jacob stood firm, feeling the connection to his friends strengthening, his resolve hardening like steel. With a final, defiant shout, Jacob pushed the energy of the Veilstone back, using his own strength to break the hold it had on him. And then, everything went silent. The shadows faded, and the light of the catalyst dimmed, leaving Jacob standing alone in the chamber, breathing heavily. The Veilstone's influence was still there, but it was weaker now, its hold on him diminished. He wasn't sure if the battle was over, or if it had just begun. But one thing was certain: he had made his choice. The darkness was not his master. He was. Chapter 25. The Path Forward. Jacob's breath came in ragged gasps as the dust settled. The last echoes of the creature's fury still reverberated in the air, but the oppressive weight that had been crushing him had lifted, if only for a moment. He glanced around the chamber, trying to gather his bearings. The crack in the floor where the creature had emerged still glowed faintly, a reminder of the battle that had just taken place. But the shadows were retreating, for now. "I did it. I actually did it." The thought was both a relief and a burden. The Veilstone had been beaten back, but Jacob knew it wouldn't stay down forever. It had shown its true face, its monstrous form, and it would return. But for now, he had won a battle, and that was enough. The darkness in the room continued to fade as Jacob steadied himself, pushing himself to his feet. He could still feel the energy of the catalyst coursing through him, a steady hum beneath his skin. It wasn't just the Veilstone's power that he could feel now, it was his own. His control over it had grown, and with it, his confidence. He wasn't just a kid anymore. He was a force to be reckoned with. "Jacob." The voice shattered the silence, and Jacob spun around, his heart leaping in his chest. He hadn't expected anyone to find him so quickly, yet here was Lyra, her face a mixture of relief and worry. "Lyra," Jacob called out, his voice cracking with emotion. He had thought he might never see her again, but here she was, standing before him as if nothing had changed. She rushed to his side, her eyes scanning him with intensity. "Are you okay?" she asked, reaching for his arm to steady him. "We heard what happened. There was a huge explosion of energy just now." "What did you do?" Jacob swallowed hard, still processing everything. I pushed it back. The Veilstone. It tried to take control, but I resisted. I'm not sure if it's over, but you're not alone in this," Lyra interrupted, her voice firm. "We're in this together. All of us. Owen, Ella, and we're with you, every step of the way." Jacob nodded, a sense of calm settling over him. It was strange, but in that moment, with Lyra at his side, he didn't feel alone anymore. They were in this fight together, and no matter what came next, he wasn't facing it by himself. Suddenly, a loud rumble shook the ground beneath them. Jacob's eyes widened as the floor cracked further, a deep fissure opening in the stone. The entire chamber seemed to be alive, reacting to the battle that had just occurred. "Jacob," Lyra shouted, grabbing his arm as the ground trembled. "We need to get out of here, now." Before Jacob could respond, the walls of the chamber began to collapse inward, the stone groaning under the pressure. He could feel the Veilstone stirring again, its energy reaching out like a clawed hand, trying to drag him back into its depths. "No, not again," Jacob muttered, his hand tightening around the catalyst. The air was thick with the hum of dark energy, but this time, Jacob wasn't afraid. This time, he knew what he had to do. He closed his eyes and focused, channeling the power within him. The light of the catalyst flared brighter, cutting through the darkness and holding it at bay. "We're not leaving empty-handed," Jacob said, his voice unwavering. "If the Veilstone wants to play, we'll take the fight to it." Lyra gave him a sharp nod, her expression resolute. "I'm with you, Jacob. Let's end this." The ground shook again, and the fissure widened, threatening to swallow them both. But Jacob stood firm, pulling Lyra back as he focused on the energy surging within him. He could feel the Veilstone's grip tightening, but he wasn't going to let it take him. He wasn't going to let it take anyone. "Jacob, look out!" Lyra screamed. Jacob turned just in time to see a wave of shadow shoot toward them, a tidal wave of darkness that could obliterate everything in its path. The force of it was immense, and for a moment, Jacob thought it would be the end. But then, just as the darkness was about to consume them, something shifted. The catalyst flared again, a brilliant burst of light that surged outward in a shockwave, slamming into the wave of darkness. The explosion of energy was deafening. The walls cracked, and the shadows recoiled, but the force of the blast didn't stop. It surged outward, expanding, pushing back the darkness with a power that Jacob had never thought possible. The ground trembled one last time, and then there was silence. Jacob opened his eyes, breathing heavily. The room had changed. The Veilstone's influence had faded, and the chamber was now bathed in the soft glow of the catalyst's light. For a long moment, there was no sound, no movement, just the aftermath of a battle that had, for now, been won. "Is it over?" Lyra whispered, her voice soft with awe. Jacob looked around, still processing what had just happened. The darkness had been driven back, but the Veilstone was still there, lingering in the shadows, waiting. Jacob could feel it. He could feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edges of his senses. "It's not over," Jacob said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "But we've taken the first step." Together, they stood in the stillness of the chamber, knowing that the true battle was still ahead. Chapter 26. Leaving the chamber. The oppressive silence of the chamber was broken only by the soft hum of the catalyst as it dimmed, its light fading to a gentle glow. Jacob stood at the center of the room, his heart still pounding from the battle. The darkness that had surrounded him, the weight of the Veilstone pressing down, had lifted, at least for now. But as he turned to face Lyra, the reality of their situation sank in. "Jacob." Lyra's voice was tentative, her eyes scanning the room. "What now?" Jacob took a deep breath. He could still feel the Veilstone's pull in the back of his mind, a faint whisper of dark energy that threatened to rise again. It had been powerful, but it wasn't invincible. Not as long as he had control. Not as long as his friends were by his side. "We keep moving forward," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty lingering in his chest. "We need to find Owen and Ella. They're still out there." Lyra nodded, her expression determined. "We'll find them, together." As the two of them made their way to the exit of the chamber, Jacob could feel the weight of the catalyst against his chest. It pulsed softly, almost like it was alive, responding to his every step. There was no doubt in his mind anymore, it was a part of him. And if it was going to be part of this fight, he would carry it with him, no matter what. The air outside the chamber was different. Less oppressive, but still thick with tension. The narrow stone corridor stretched out before them, leading to an unknown destination. The walls were cracked and scarred, a testament to the violence that had taken place here. But as they moved down the hallway, Jacob couldn't help but notice how much the world outside seemed so normal. Outside, beyond the chamber, the world hadn't changed. The sounds of the city, cars honking, people talking, the distant hum of electronics, continued on like nothing had happened. It was as if the world was oblivious to the battle that had raged beneath its surface. To the power of the Veilstone. To everything Jacob had just faced. "Just like before," Jacob murmured, his voice low. "Nothing's changed. Not here, anyway." Lyra gave him a curious glance. "What do you mean?" "Look around," he said, gesturing to the world beyond. "It's like the rest of the world keeps moving on, but here, inside this, whatever you want to call it, things are different." We're fighting for something that no one else knows about. Everyone else is just living their lives. Yeah, Lyra said with a half smile. But that's what makes what we're doing so important. They don't know what's going on, but we do. And we're the ones who can stop it. Jacob nodded. He wasn't entirely sure he believed that yet, but it felt right. They were fighting not just for themselves, but for the world outside, whether it knew it or not. The two of them continued down the corridor, moving swiftly, the faint light of the catalyst their only source of illumination. As they turned the corner, Jacob's heart skipped a beat. There, ahead of them, was the exit, an archway leading into the cool night air of the city beyond. He could hear the faint sounds of traffic, the distant murmur of people walking by, oblivious to the dangers lurking beneath their feet. The world was still there, unchanged, but Jacob knew it was just a matter of time before things escalated. "Do you think we can really stop the Veilstone?" Lyra asked as they reached the archway, her voice quiet but hopeful. Jacob hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. Could they? Was he truly capable of facing this power? But then, the memory of the battle in the chamber surfaced, the way he had pushed the darkness back, the way the catalyst had responded to him. He wasn't sure how he had done it, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't do it alone. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice firm. "Together." Lyra smiled, her eyes shining with quiet determination. "Then let's go find Owen and Ella." With one final glance back at the chamber, Jacob stepped out into the cool night, the city's lights blinking in the distance like stars in the sky. The normalcy of the world seemed almost surreal after everything that had happened, but Jacob knew that the next steps they took would be anything but normal. They had to be ready. Whatever came next, they couldn't stop now. As the two of them walked into the unknown, Jacob's thoughts drifted back to the Veilstone. The catalyst. The dark energy still lingering in his chest. He didn't know how this would all play out, but he was ready to face it head on. With Lyra by his side, and his friends close behind, there was nothing that could stop them. Not yet. To be continued.